Chapter 14. Snape's Grudge. It wasn't until dawn, after spending another night in squashy purple sleeping bags on the floor of the Great Hall with all the other houses, that word finally began to spread about what had happened. Sirius Black had made another strike at Gryffindor Tower and had very nearly killed Ron Weasley before evading capture again. The story leaked out from the Gryffindors at breakfast, muttered across aisles and between friends and siblings, and pretty soon the entire school had heard some version of the night's events. In one tale, Black had torn his way straight through the portrait hole and stormed the boys' dormitory with an axe in his hands, swinging wildly and chopping up curtains and bedposts. Another told of Black being a vampire, able to turn himself into mist and float in through an open window before attempting to strangle Ron with his bare hands. Most disturbing, of course, was the truth, which Violet overheard from Ron himself. He was happy to tell anyone who asked, and Violet joined the small crowd around him and listened in. I was asleep, and I heard this ripping noise, and I thought it was in my dream, you know. But then there was this draft. I woke up and one side of the hangings on my bed had been pulled down. I rolled over, and I saw him standing over me, like a skeleton with loads of filthy hair, holding this great long knife, must have been 12 inches. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and then I yelled and hescampered. He had the password to the common room, Harry muttered to Violet, while the rest of the crowd huddled excitedly around Ron. Neville wrote them all down, since Sir Cadogan keeps coming up with mad ones and changing them all the time, but then he lost the list, and I suppose Black found it. Neville was in total disgrace. Professor McGonagall was so furious with him, she had banned him from all future Hogsmeade visits, given him detention, and forbidden anyone to give him the password into Gryffindor Tower. Harry told Violet that poor Neville was forced to wait outside the common room every night for somebody to let him in. None of these punishments, however, came close to matching the one his grandmother had in store for him. 2 days after Black's break-in, she sent Neville the very worst thing a Hogwarts student could receive over breakfast, a howler. Violet only caught a blur of movement out of the corner of her eye as Neville streaked past out of the great hall, holding the envelope before him like a bomb. The howler went off in the entrance hall, Neville's grandmother's voice, magically magnified to 100 times its usual volume, shrieking about how he had brought shame on the whole family. As badly as Violet felt for Neville, she was dealing with an uncomfortable situation of her own. "I really think you should tell someone," Tracy said, looking Violet very seriously in the eye. "I know it's meant to be a secret, and that it's Harry's too, but I'm not handing it in," Violet hissed stubbornly. "Black's not coming in through Honeydukes, Tracy. We'd have heard if there was a break-in. But the other secret paths, Filch knows about the rest, and the ones he doesn't are blocked anyways. It's fine." "What are you two arguing about?" Cassius asked, appearing at Violet's side. She and Tracy were talking, of course, about the Marauders map and the tunnel that lead from the One-Eyed Witch all the way to Hogsmeade Village. While Tracy had seen the map and made Violet explain what it was a secret that the girls had kept from Cassius. "Nothing, Cass," Violet said, shooting a warning glare at Tracy, who had just opened her mouth. Just theories about how Sirius Black's been getting in, that's all." "Well, he's not a bloody vampire, I can tell you that much," Cass said, smirking. "I hear that one's popular with the first years, and some particularly stupid 7th years as well." He looked between Violet and Tracy, suspicion creeping back into his eyes. "Are Yowsariva everything's all right? You're not really fighting, are you?" "Of course not," Tracy said stiffly. "Me and Violet never disagree, you know that." Violet rolled her eyes. It wasn't that she wasn't worried about how Black was getting into the castle, she was very worried about it, and afraid that he had managed to do it without getting caught again. The problem was that she didn't want to give up the map, or the secret passage that allowed her and Harry to visit Hogsmeade with their friends. It was the only bit of fun they could have without all the teachers hovering over them, especially in light of the recent attack, and Violet wasn't about to give that up easily. nor would she take it from Harry, with whom she had already made plans to visit the village next weekend. This time they would just have to be more careful. On Saturday morning, Violet fastened the leather cord which contained her ghost ring around her neck, slipped the marauder's map into her pocket, and went down to breakfast with everyone else. She waited in the entrance hall for Harry to finish his breakfast, and the two of them loudly waved goodbye to their friends as everybody else proceeded to the front doors. As soon as they were alone, Harry and Violet hurried up to the third floor and went straight to the statue of the one-eyed witch. Violet pulled out the marauder's map and smoothed it out. A tiny dot was moving in their direction. Violet squinted at it. The minuscule writing next to it read Neville Longbottom. "Hurry," she said to Harry, who quickly pulled out his wand, muttered, "Descendium," and shoved his bag into the statue. But before either of them could climb in, Neville came around the corner. "Harry, I forgot you weren't going to Hogsmeade either. Oh, hello, Violet." "Hi, Neville," Violet said, swiftly shoving the map back into her pocket and adopting what she hoped was a casual pose against the statue. "What are you up to?" "Nothing," shrugged Neville. "Want a game of exploding snap?" Not now," said Harry. "We're going to go to the library and do that vampire essay for Lupin." "I'll come with you," said Neville brightly. "I haven't done it either." "Actually, I've finished mine," Violet said. "I was just going to let Harry look over it." "Great. Can you help me too?" said Neville, his round face anxious. "I don't understand that thing about the garlic at all. Do they have to eat it?" Or he broke off with a small gasp, looking over Harry's shoulder. It was Professor Snape. Neville took a quick step behind Harry. "And what are you three doing here?" said Professor Snape, coming to a halt and looking between each of them. An odd place to meet. To Violet's immense disquiet, Snape's black eyes flicked to the doorways on either side of them, and then to the one-eyed witch, which she was still leaning uncomfortably against. "We're not meeting here," said Harry. "We just met here." "Indeed," said Professor Snape. "The two of you have a habit of turning up in unexpected places together, and you are very rarely there for no good reason, Mr. Potter. I suggest you and Longbottom return to Gryffindor Tower, where you belong, while Miss Potter makes her way down to the dungeons, where she belongs." Violet rankled at being addressed in the third person, especially when she was standing right there, but joined Harry and Neville in slinking off without another word. As they turned the corner, Violet looked back. Professor Snape was running one of his hands over the one-eyed witch's head, examining it closely. They managed to shake Neville off at the fat lady by Harry telling him the password, then Violet making a show of demanding Harry spend his time with her instead. They doubled back, and as soon as they were out of sight of the security trolls, Violet pulled the map out again and held it close to her nose. The third-floor corridor seemed to be deserted. Violet and Harry scanned the map carefully and saw, with a leap of relief, that the tiny dot labeled Severus Snape was now back in his office. They sprinted back to the one-eyed witch, opened her hump, heaved their bodies inside, and slid down to meet Harry's bag at the bottom of the stone chute. Violet wiped the marauder's map blank again, then the two of them set off at a run. Harry and Violet, completely hidden beneath Harry's invisibility cloak, emerged into the sunlight outside Honeyduke's and met up with Ron, who had clearly been waiting for them. "It's us," Harry muttered, prodding Ron in the back. "What kept you?" Ron hissed. "Professor Snape was hanging around," Violet said as they headed up the high street. "I said I would meet Tracy at Zonko's. Can you take us there?" "Yeah, course. But there's somewhere I wanted you two to see first." They went to the post office. Ron pretended to be checking the price of an owl to his brother Bill in Egypt so that Harry and Violet could have a good look around. The owls sat hooting softly down at them, at least 300 of them, from great greys right down to little tiny scarps owls, local deliveries only, which were so small they could have sat in the palm of Violet's hand. Then they visited Zonko's. Tracy was waiting just outside, as she'd promised, and smiled hopefully at Ron as he approached, seemingly by himself. "We're here," Violet said quietly, making her jump. Oh, right, I thought you would be. Good to, see you." Zonko's were so packed with students that Harry and Violet had to exercise great care not to tread on anyone and cause a panic. There were jokes and tricks to fulfill even Fred and George's wildest dreams. Harry and Violet whispered orders to their friends and passed money from under the cloak. They all left Zonko's with their money bags considerably lighter than they had been on entering, but their pockets bulging with dung bombs, hiccup sweets, frog spawn soap, and a nose-biting teacup apiece. The day was fine and breezy, and none of them felt like staying indoors. Harry and Ron wanted to visit the Shrieking Shack, which was supposedly the most haunted dwelling in Britain. As much as Violet would have liked to see it, too, she didn't miss the look of fear on Tracy's face and made the choice to stay back with her. As they passed the 3 broomsticks, Violet pulled the boys around a secluded corner and slipped out from beneath the invisibility cloak. "Be careful, Roman 6, warned Harry's voice from somewhere next to Ron's shoulder. "And don't go too far, all right? Meet us back here in a bit." "Yeah, I'll catch up," Violet promised, grinning as she stepped out from the shadows. While Ron and her brother headed up the slope to lead them to the shack, Violet and Tracy snuck off to one of Hogsmeade's small parks, largely ignored by the visiting students in favor of all the shops and other entertaining landmarks. It was a beautiful little area, though Violet would have thought it was more like a public garden than a proper park. There were 2 elegant stone benches set on opposite sides of the courtyard, the ground of which was a grand mosaic featuring a rather bloody scene of goblin warfare. Moss had begun to creep in between the gaps between its tiles and up the legs of the benches, which would have given the place an air of abandonment if not for all the flowers. Dozens and dozens of varieties were in bloom all around them, lurid pink, like the ones Lockhart had once decorated the great hall with, towering orchids whose petals formed mocking faces, roses that were black as night with thorns nearly an inch long, tiny purple flowers with little dark blue stems and little wild polka dots on their leaves, shoots of green that might have been mistaken for weeds if not for the pleasantly sweet scent they emitted when rustled by even the slightest breeze. It was a beautiful place, and Violet wanted to sit and stare at it for hours. "I hope this isn't a private garden," Tracy said anxiously as the pair of them sank onto the nearest bench, brushing aside fallen petals as they did so. "I think it's public," Violet said, craning around for any sort of sign to suggest otherwise. "There isn't a fence or anything." "Yeah, but wizards, you know," Violet laughed. The 2 of them sat and chatted for several minutes, remarking on the weather and the flowers around them, and how nice it was to be out of the castle for a little while. When Violet asked where Cass was, Tracy told her he'd gone to meet up with some other students from his own year at the 3 broomsticks. "I think he just wanted to try and chat up Madame Rosmeter again," Tracy whispered conspiratorially. "Honestly, I don't know what any of them expect. She's not likely to look twice at some pimply schoolboy, is she?" "Ron was looking after her, too," Violet said, "the last time we met there. He made a point of being the one to go and grab us drinks, and he came back all flushed. Do you remember?" "I was too surprised to see you there to pay attention to Ron," said Tracy. "Cass and I were just sitting there talking about what sort of things we wanted to bring back for you, and then there you were. And then the Minister of Magic and all the teachers showed up. Of course, I know you were under the table and couldn't see, but even while they were talking about all that horrible business with Sirius Black, Cass wasteltreeing to peer around at Madame Rosmeter. Honestly, I'm sure he was just trying to hear better," Violet said, trying to give Cass the benefit of the doubt, but Tracy just snorted. "Oh, but he's not subtle. He gets this look on his face whenever there's a pretty girl around. He gets it around you all the time, you know." Violet let out a startled little laugh. "What? But I'm not a pretty girl, of course you are," Tracy said, as though shocked Violet would say such a thing. "Violet, you must be joking. Have you looked in a mirror lately? Don't you see the way boys have been looking at you in the halls this year?" Violet's face flushed a deep, hot scarlet. She had looked in a mirror and saw nothing but a face that looked nearly identical to her brother's, and as for people looking at her in the halls, She hate being looked at, and specifically avoided people's eyes so as not to see if they were watching her or not. It was stressful enough to feel eyes on her at all times without actually having to meet them. I guess I never noticed, she muttered awkwardly, dropping her gaze. I don't think about that sort of stuff, Tracy. Well, you are a pretty, said Tracy matter-of-factly. She heaved a deep sigh. I wish people would look at me the way they look at you sometimes. Violet didn't know what to say to that. She'd never paid much attention to the way other students perceived her, or whether or not boys were paying attention to her, but that sort of thing had always seemed to matter to Tracy. Violet remembered how disappointed she'd been last year on Valentine's Day when not a single singing, card-bearing Cupid had come her way, and how her face had fallen when messages of love were delivered to other students within earshot. Though she had never spoken about having an interest in any of the boys in their year, there was no denying Tracy had a streak of romanticism in her. All of a sudden, Violet was aware of just how closely together the two of them were sitting, despite the size of the bench on which they sat. She and Tracy had always been close. They huddled next to each other at meal times, draped arms over one another while studying in the common room. They had even shared each other's beds dozens of times when Violet was suffering nightmares, or when the cold nights prompted more warmth than the covers could provide. And this was, after all, the second time Tracy had made a point of telling Violet how pretty she was. Was that all done in friendship? Violet had no real frame of reference. She'd never been this close with anyone besides Harry, who was her twin brother, and Harry had never made her feel like that. Violet looked up at Tracy, though her eyelashes, a strange, fluttering sensation in her stomach. Tracy had her eyes closed and her head tilted back, enjoying the warm sun on her round face. One of her hands rested on the bench between them, and shaking slightly, Violet covered it with her own. I think you're pretty, too, she heard herself say, and then Violet was leaning forward and pressing her lips against Tracy's. She didn't really know what she was doing. She had seen kisses on television and in the chaste, brief pecks between Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia. Violet had read about them as well in some of her story books, but in all of those stories, whenever a kiss was described, it mentioned a spark or a warmth or some sort of connection that flowed between the people kissing. Violet felt an eruption of bright sparks in her chest as she pressed her closed lips against Tracy's, but after a moment with no sort of reaction, Violet slowly pulled away and found Tracy staring at her. Her brown eyes were wide, and though not cold, they reflected none of the fireworks that Violet was currently feeling. Tracy's mouth was still closed, and she wasn't smiling. She pulled her hand out from beneath Violet's. "Thank you," Tracy said slowly, "for calling me pretty." "That's very sweet of you, Violet. I'm really glad to have you as a friend. You know, I think we make a pair of really good friends." The eruptions in Violet's chest ceased abruptly, replaced by what felt like a hollow, infinite void, as though all her insides had been vanished without a trace. Oh, she stammered. "Yeah, I'm glad we're friends, too. Sorry for I didn't mean to." Tracy stood up and Violet flinched, but the other girl simply held out her hand for Violet to take. Trembling, Violet did so and allowed herself to be pulled to her feet. Her legs felt like jelly beneath her. Tracy didn't let go of her hand, but if she had, Violet wasn't sure if she'd been able to keep standing. "Let's go and find Cass, okay?" Tracy said, smiling now. Violet didn't trust herself to speak. She nodded meekly instead. Hand in hand, the two of them headed out of the beautiful flower garden and back into the village. The ringing was starting up in the back of Violet's head, growing louder and louder with every wobbly step she took. They had just reached the outside of the Three Broomsticks when something latched onto Violet's arm. "Ow!" said Harry's voice from the air, and the pressure disappeared from Violet's arm. "Romans 6, what, it's me." "Look, we've got to go, now get back under here, quick." Before Violet could protest or do anything, really, besides open her mouth in shock, Harry had thrown the invisibility cloak overhead and ripped her out of Tracy's grasp. He dragged Violet back in the direction of Honeydukes. "Malfoy saw me," he panted, when they were safely through the trapdoor, throwing the cloak back off of them and tucking it beneath his arm. He looked very pale. Not all of me, just my head eye was throwing snowballs at him, and the cloak slipped where Vito get back to the castle. Violet, still stunned from her own misadventures, could only stare in shock and allow herself to be pulled along the passage at breakneck speed after her brother. Her head was reeling with too many thoughts and emotions to process a single one at that moment. But Violet knew instinctively that both of them were in terrible trouble, for one reason or another. Panting, a sharp pain in their sides, Violet and Harry didn't slow down until they reached the stone slide. Violet shimmied up it first, fast as she could, her sweaty hands slipping on the sides of the chute. She reached the inside of the witch's hump, tapped it with her wand, hoisted herself through, and turned right around to pull Harry through after her. The hump closed, and just as the two of them jumped out from behind the statue, they heard quick footsteps approaching. It was Professor Snape. He approached Harry and Violet swiftly, his black robe swishing, then stopped in front of them. "So," he said. There was a look of suppressed triumph about him. Violet tried to look innocent, all too aware of her sweaty face and muddy hands, which she quickly hid in her pockets. "Come with me, you two," said Professor Snape. Harry and Violet didn't even dare to exchange glances as they followed Snape downstairs, trying to wipe their hands clean in the inside of their robes without him noticing. They walked down the stairs to the dungeons and then into Professor Snape's office. Violet had been in here several times before and had been in serious trouble for nearly all of them. She noted that Professor Snape had acquired a few more interesting things in jars since the last time, all standing on the shelves behind his desk, glinting in the firelight and adding to the threatening atmosphere. "Sit," said Professor Snape. Harry and Violet sat. Snape, however, remained standing. For once, his eyes were fixed solely on Harry. "Mr. Malfoy has just been to see me with a strange story, Potter," said Professor Snape. Harry didn't say anything. "He tells me that he was up by the Shrieking Shack when he ran into Weasley apparently alone. Mr. Malfoy states that he was standing talking to Weasley when a large amount of mud hit him in the back of the head. How do you think that could have happened?" Harry was doing a very poor job of looking innocently surprised. "I don't know, Professor." Snape's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Mr. Malfoy then saw an extraordinary apparition. Can you imagine what it might have been, Potter?" "No," said Harry. "It was your head, Potter, floating in midair." There was a long silence, made longer by the fact that Violet had apparently forgotten to breathe. She used all of her willpower not to turn and glare at her stupid brother. "Maybe he'd better go to Madame Pomfrey," said Harry slowly. "If he's seeing things like, what would your head have been doing in Hogsmeade, Potter?" said Professor Snape softly, and Violet's whole body tensed at the deadly tone. "Your head is not allowed in Hogsmeade. No part of your body has permission to be in Hogsmeade." "Ether off your bodies," he said, his gaze cutting to Violet, whose insides suddenly rematerialized, only to churn with sickness. "We know that," said Harry, still foolishly trying to outwit a man who Violet firmly believed could not be fooled. "It sounds like Malfoy's having hallucin. Malfoy is not having hallucinations," snarled Snape, and he bent down, a hand on each arm of Harry's chair, so that their faces were a foot apart. "If your head was in Hogsmeade, so was the rest of you." "We've been in Gryffindor Tower," said Harry. "Like you told both of you. Do you mean to tell me you've been giving out the Gryffindor password, Potter, to students outside your own house, so soon after another housemate of yours was attacked?" Harry, wisely, didn't say anything. Snape's thin mouth curled into a horrible smile. "So," he said, straightening up again, "everyone from the Minister of Magic downward has been trying to keep the famous Potter twins safe from Sirius Black. But the famous Potters are a law unto themselves. Let the ordinary people worry about their safety. Famous Harry Potter goes where he wants to, with no thought for the consequences. Violet was going to be sick. She was really going to be sick. How extraordinarily like your father you are, Potter," Professor Snape said suddenly, staring at Harry with a dark glint in his eyes. He too was exceedingly arrogant, A small amount of talent on the Quidditch field made him think he was a cut above the rest of us too, strutting around the place with his friends and admirers. The resemblance between you is uncanny." "My dad didn't strut," said Harry hotly. "And neither do I. Your father didn't set much store by rules either," Professor Snape went on, clearly pressing his advantage, his thin face full of malice like Violet had never seen. Rules were for lesser mortals, not Quidditch Cup winners. His head was so swollen. "Shut up!" Harry was suddenly on his feet, standing in front of Professor Snape with his fists balled at his sides. Violet jumped up, too, desperately pulling at her brother's arm to make him stand down. Professor Snape had gone rigid, his black eyes flashing dangerously. "What did you say to me, Potter?" "I told you to shut up about my dad," Harry yelled, trying to shrug Violet away from him. "We know the truth, all right. He saved your life. Dumbledore told us. You wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for our dad." "Harry, please." Violet whined faintly, trying to insert herself between the two of them before things could get any worse. Professor Snape's pale hand closed over her shoulder, and Violet found herself roughly pushed aside. "And did the headmaster tell you the circumstances in which your father saved my life?" Snape whispered. "Or did he consider the details too unpleasant for the precious Potter's delicate ears?" Harry bit his lip. No, of course. Dumbledore hadn't told them the whole truth, and he clearly didn't want to admit it, but Professor Snape seemed to have guessed as much. "I would hate for you to run away with a false idea of your father, Potter," he said, a terrible grin twisting his face. "Have you been imagining some act of glorious heroism? Then let me correct you. Your saintly father and his friends played a highly amusing joke on me that would have resulted in my death if your father hadn't gotten cold feet at the last moment. There was nothing heroic about what he did. He was saving his own skin as much as mine. Had their joke succeeded, he would have been expelled from Hogwarts." Snape's uneven, yellowish teeth were bared. "Turn out your pockets, Potter," he spat suddenly. Harry didn't move. He made the mistake of glancing at Violet, and Professor Snape whirled on her as well. "Both of you turn out your pockets, or we go straight to the headmaster." "Pull them out now." Cold with dread, Violet slowly pulled out her bag from Zonko's and set it next to Harry's, and then the Marauder's map. Snape picked up the Zonko's bags. "Our friends gave us those," Harry said at once. Violet couldn't believe he was still trying to lie his way out of this. They'd been caught. There wasn't a point, but Harry just wasn't getting the memo. They brought them back from Hogsmeade last time, indeed, and you've been carrying them around ever since. How very touching." "And what is this?" Professor Snape had picked up the map, and he was looking right at Violet now. Violet tried with all her might not to be sick all over the office floor. "It's spare bit of parchment," Harry interrupted with a shrug. "I didn't ask you, boy," Snape snapped, his eyes now boring into Violet's. "What is it?" Violet shrugged soundlessly. Professor Snape turned the map over in his hands, his eyes never leaving Violet. "A bit of parchment. Surely you don't need such a very old piece of parchment," he said. "Why don't I just throw this away?" His hand moved toward the fire. "No," said Harry and Violet together. "So," said Snape, eyes flashing. "Is this another treasured gift from your little friends, or is it something else? A letter, perhaps, written in visible ink? Or instructions to get into Hogsmeade without passing the Dementors?" Violet's eyes welled with tears. Snape's lip curled nastily. Let me see," he muttered, taking out his wand and smoothing the map out on his desk. "Reveal your secrets," he said, touching the wand to the parchment. Nothing happened. Violet clenched her hands to stop them from shaking. "Show yourself," Professor Snape said, tapping the map sharply. It stayed blank. Beside her, Harry was taking deep, calming breaths. "Professor Severus Snape, master of this school, command you to yield the information you conceal," Snape said, hitting the map with his wand. As though an invisible hand were writing upon it, words appeared on the smooth surface of the map. "Mr. Mooney presents his compliments to Professor Snape and begs him to keep his abnormally large nose out of other people's business." Snape froze. Violet stared at the message and felt her heart stall in her chest. But the map didn't stop there. More writing was appearing beneath the first. Mr. Prongs agrees with Mr. Mooney and would like to add that Professor Snape is an ugly git. Violet was certain it couldn't get any worse. She was, of course, wrong. Mr. Padfoot would like to register his astonishment that an idiot like that ever became a professor. Violet closed her eyes in horror. When she'd opened them, the map had had its last word. Mr. Wormtail bids Professor Snape good day and advises him to wash his hair, the slime ball. Harry and Violet waited for the blow to fall. So, said Professor Snape softly, we'll see about this. He strode across to his fire, seized a fistful of glittering powder from a jar on the fireplace, and threw it into the flames. Lupin, Snape called into the fire. I want a word. Utterly bewildered, Violet and Harry stared into the fire. A large shape had appeared in it, revolving very fast. Seconds later, Professor Lupin was clambering out of the fireplace, brushing ash off his shabby robes. You called Severus, said Lupin mildly. I certainly did, said Professor Snape, his face contorted with fury as he strode back to his desk. I have just asked the Potters to empty their pockets. Miss Sparta was carrying this. Professor Snape pointed at the parchment, on which the words of Messrs. Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs were still shining. An odd, closed expression appeared on Professor Lupin's face. Well, said Snape. Lupin continued to stare at the map. Violet had the impression that he was doing some very quick thinking. Well, said Professor Snape again, this parchment is plainly full of dark magic. This is supposed to be your area of expertise, Lupin. Where do you imagine Miss Potter got such a thing? Professor Lupin looked up, and by the merest half-glance in Harry and Violet's direction, warned them not to interrupt. Full of dark magic, he repeated mildly. Do you really think so, Severus? It looks to me as though it is merely a piece of parchment that insults anybody who tries to read it. Childish, but surely not dangerous. I imagine Violet got it from a joke shop. Indeed, said Professor Snape. His jaw had gone rigid with anger. You think a joke shop could supply her with such a thing? You don't think it more likely that she got it directly from the manufacturers? Violet looked quickly at Lupin and saw him do a funny sort of double blink. She had no idea what Professor Snape was talking about, but Professor Lupin was doing an admirable job of pretending, didn't. You mean by Mr. Wormtail or one of these people, he said. Violet, Harry, do you know any of these people? No, said Harry quickly. Violet shook her head slowly, her thoughts flickering to the message to Mooney scrawled on the back of her mother's photograph. You see, Severus, said Professor Lupin, turning back to Professor Snape. It looks like a Zonko product to me. Right on cue, Ron came bursting into the office. He was completely out of breath, and he stopped just short of Snape's desk, clutching the stitch in his chest and trying to speak. I gave the twins that stuff, he choked. Bought it in Zonko's. Ages ago. Well, said Professor Lupin, clapping his hands together and looking around cheerfully. That seems to clear that up. Severus, I'll take this back, shall I? He folded the map and tucked it inside his robes. Violet, Harry, Ron, come with me. I need a word about my vampire essay. Excuse us. Severus. Violet didn't dare look at Professor Snape as they left his office. She, her brother, and Ron followed Professor Lupin all the way back to the entrance hall before speaking. Then Harry turned to Lupin. Professor, I don't want to hear explanations, said Professor Lupin shortly. He glanced around the empty entrance hall and lowered his voice. I happen to know that this map was confiscated by Mr. Filch many years ago. Yes, I know it's a map, he said, as the three of them looked amazed. I don't want to know how it fell into your possession. I am, however, astounded that neither of you handed it in, particularly after what happened the last time a student left information about the castle lying around. And I can't let you have it back, Violet. Violet had expected that, but began to cry again anyways. She felt a sob perched at the back of her throat and didn't dare open her mouth to protest. It was Harry who spoke up. Why did Snape think we got it from the manufacturers? He said. Because. Professor Lupin hesitated. Because these map makers would have wanted to lure you out of school. They'd think it extremely entertaining. Do you know them? Harry asked, sounding impressed. We've met, Professor Lupin said shortly, but it was obvious to Violet that there was much more to it than that. She was trying to get her tears under control to ask about it, but Professor Lupin was looking between her and Harry more seriously than ever. Don't expect me to cover up for you again. I cannot make you take Sirius Black seriously. But I would have thought that what you have heard when the Dementors draw near you would have had more of an effect on you. Your parents gave their lives to keep you two alive. A poor way to repay them gambling their sacrifice for a bag of magic tricks. He walked away, leaving Violet feeling worse by far than she had at any point in Professor Snape's office. Harry and Ron were already heading away, Ron muttering that it was his fault while Harry feebly tried to defend him. Violet was left alone in the entrance hall, with tears in her eyes and a terrible hollowness in her stomach. Worst of all, the ringing was back in her ears. It stung that Professor Lupin had not only confiscated the map, but also refused to tell them how Hecknewit was a map in the first place. Fred and George had been adamant that they were the only ones who knew about it before giving it to Harry and Violet, and before that it had been sitting in Filch's office for God only knows how many years, but Lupin had known about that, too. Hadn't he just said he knew for a fact the map had been confiscated by Mr. Filch? How could he have known such a thing unless the Marauder's map was taken from him? Violet, nearly at the entrance of the staircase leading down the slithering common room, whipped around and sprinted back in the direction she'd just come. Her feet pounded on the flagstones of the entrance hall and the marble of the grand staircase, threatening to draw the attention of Mr. Filch, but Violet didn't care a whit. A dozen puzzle pieces had just fallen into place inside her head, and oh, she'd been so stupid. It was all right there. Violet rushed up the first floor and skidded loudly on the landing as she turned straight up the second. Her heart was hammering as though she'd been running for miles, and when she drew to a halt outside the familiar, not quite shut door of the defense against the dark arts teacher's office, she had to force herself to suck in several great, deep breaths of air. The ringing was so loud she felt as though her head might explode. Violet reached for the doorknob, but the door flew open before she had even touched it. It hit the stone wall with a loud bang. Professor Lupin, who had been standing over his desk with his back to the door, whirled around in alarm. "Moony," Violet said, pointing a single, shaking finger toward her professor. "You're a Moony." Professor Lupin's mouth fell open. "I what? It was you," Violet said, striding into the office with her finger still raised. She heard the door slam shut behind her. "You sent me the comb for Christmas, didn't you? You're the one who gave it to my mother." From across the room, Violet heard Professor Lupin gulp. "Oh," he said faintly. "Oh, well, yes, you knew my parents," Violet thundered. Her whole body was quaking, tense and taut like a compacted spring. "I mean you didn't just know them. They weren't just schoolmates, were they? You were their friend, you and Black, you were their friends." "Yes, I did know them," said Lupin, still in that same faint voice. "We were very close." "Why didn't you tell me?" Violet snapped, advancing another step toward him. "Me and Harry all this time, you never said." "You must have known who we were as soon as you saw us on the train, and in all of our classes the other night, with the Dementor, too. And sending me that comb without a name or a note, why haven't you said anything?" "Violet, please," said Professor Lupin, raising his hands calmly as she continued toward him. "I know you're very upset, and I don't expect you to understand. Try me," Violet snarled. A reckless rage was overtaking her, the same numbing anger that she'd been filled with on the night they'd run away from the Dursleys. Only this time it was fueled by the pain of recent rejection and the confusion that had taken hold in her heart. And Lupin, meekly standing there, provided a fine target to exercise her fury on. "I'm so tired of people keeping things from me because they think I'm too young or too stupid to know what's going on. Nobody told me and Harry that Sirius Black was friends with our dad. We had to find that out for ourselves. Did you know that? We had to overhear it on accident because nobody, not Mr. Weasley, not Hagrid, Not even Dumbledore will tell us things they think will be too much for us to hear. We're not children. Yes, you are, Lupin said, his voice suddenly sharp. I'm sorry, Violet, you may not want to hear it, but you and Harry are children. There are people who are doing their best to look out for you and protect you from the horrors of the world, not because they think you are incapable of handling them, but because you shouldn't have veto. Do you understand that? I don't care, said Violet, fists balled at her sides. We have a right to know our parents are dead, and we can't even remember them. All we've got are stories from other people, and nobody will even give us that. Violet, I promise you, no one is trying to keep you from information about your parents. Then tell me, Violet pleaded. Her voice cracked painfully, and she realized that she must have been crying the whole time. Tell me about my mother, please, you were her friend, weren't you? Yes, Lupin said, though it came out barely more than a whisper. He cleared his throat and said again, yes, I was her friend. And James' friend, and Sirius. We were in school together. That's when you made the map, isn't it? You all made it together, didn't you? Lupin drew up short for a moment, then lowered his eyes and said, yes, yes, we did. James, your father, was a brilliant wizard, even at school, and Sirius was always capable of very powerful spells. I suppose I am quite clever and good at finding information about the sort of enchantments we would need. Who was my dad? Violet demanded. Your Mooney, who are all the rest? Prongs, Lupin said, going oddly pale. James was Prongs and Sirius was Padfoot. So that makes Pettigrew Wormtail, Violet said, feeling an odd wave of triumph when Lupin raised his head sharply, clearly shocked. How do you know about Peter? I read about him, Violet lied easily. When I was researching Black, he killed him. Blew him to pieces, even though they used to be friends, because Pettigrew stood up to him after Black betrayed our parents. A terrible accusation welled up inside of Violet, aimed right at the heart of the tall, frail man in front of her. Where were you? She spat, sickly pleased when Professor Lupin flinched. I was away, he said hesitantly. Abroad. I came back as soon as I heard what had happened to James and Lily, but there wasn't anything I could do for them by then. He shook his head sadly. Little over a year before, I was helping them plan their wedding, then I had to help arrange the funeral. Were you at the wedding? Violet asked. Hagrid showed us pictures, Blacks in them, some of them, but not you. I was ill, said Professor Lupin. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it to the ceremony. You get ill a lot, don't you? Violet said before she could stop herself. Lupin looked at her sharply and held her gaze for a long, tense moment. Yes, I suppose I do, he said shortly. But that didn't stop me from attending other important events, usually birthdays, anniversaries, and the like. He swallowed again. I was there the night you and your brother were born. What? Violet gasped. Lupin let out a small, bitter laugh. Oh, yes, I very nearly didn't make it in time, but everyone got to be there in the end, me and Sirius and me, he said, frowning slightly. James would have been devastated if we'd missed it. I don't remember you, Violet said, and Lupin laughed hollowly again. What, at your birth? I'd be more concerned if you'd remember me there, Violet. That's not the sort of thing most people are able to do. But Iwasthar, out in the hall, waiting with the others. Sirius nearly broke down the door to get in when we heard Harry crying James, named him godfather right then and there, with all the nurses screaming, Lily shouting for us to get out. And then the shock on James and Lily's faces when the healer said to get ready for Theatherone to come out, meaning you, of course. It was a shock, really, but I think James was too excited to be overwhelmed by the thought of twins. Sirius was holding Harry and Lily was shouting again, and your father grabbed a hold of my arm, and he said, Professor Lupin choked off suddenly. His mouth shut, and he bowed his head, letting his graying hair fall over his forehead and into his eyes. Violet realized that he was crying too. After a moment, Lupin lifted his head again, drawing in a slow, deep breath. When he spoke again, his voice was very calm. I'm sorry, Violet, Professor Lupin said, but I am very tired. It's been a long day, and I'm sure you're tired as well. We can talk about this some other time, if you like. I know you must have so many questions, but I can't answer any more today. Please, any other time, hearing such a plaintive, desperate plea would have set Violet cowering, apologizing until she was blue in the face and eager to do whatever she could to make it right. But this was not any other time. This was now, and though the ringing in her ears had abated since Professor Lupin had started talking, now that he'd stopped she could feel it building up again, louder and louder like a distant insect swarm. A memory was dragging itself out of the recesses of her mind. Not an old memory, not even a particularly strong one, but something about it stood out to her. It took form as she stood there, staring at Professor Lupin. Just a snippet of words that she'd heard and briefly puzzled over. Professor Snape explaining why he wouldn't sign her Hogsmeade permission form, and no explaining why he thought someone else might have. The memory sharpened and clicked into place. "You're my godfather," Violet said quietly. "Aren't you?" Professor Lupin didn't move. His head remained bowed, though she could see his shoulders shaking slightly. "Aren't you?" she repeated louder. Lupin sucked in a deep, rattling gulp of air and looked up at Violet. James said, "The next one's yours to look after," he said thickly. "And I don't suppose I've done a very good job of that, have I?" The ringing in Violet's head ramped up to a klaxon, a deafening siren, a shrill, ear-splitting, sourceless scream. She had a godfather. She had a godfather, one who wasn't a murderer, who hadn't betrayed her parents and left them for dead. And here he was right in front of her, right now. After all this time of being all alone in the world, without a soul to rely on besides her twin brother now. "Where were you?" Violet heard herself ask again. Why am I just learning about Yauno? If you were supposed to look after me, then why, when your parents were Lupin stopped, swallowed hard, then tried again. When James and Lily passed away, everything was thrown into chaos. There were plenty of arguments among those of us closest to them about what should be done with you and Harry. Several families, friends of your parents, wanted to take you in and raise you as their own, but Albus was adamant you should be with Uriel family. Lily's sister and her husband, he said you would be safest there. But what about you? Violet pushed. If our dad made you my godfather, why didn't we go to you? Professor Lupin laughed again, a more broken sound than before. His hands were curled into fists on the surface of the desk, thin and white-knuckled. As much as I would have liked that, Violet, it was never an option. Everyone talked in circles around it, bless them, but I always knew that I was unfit to be anyone's guardian. "Because you're a werewolf," said Violet flatly. Lupin's head jerked up. She could see his eyes now, wide and startled in his tear-stained face. He'd gone very, very pale. "You really are brilliant, aren't you?" she heard him say softly after a long moment of staring. "How long have you known?" "Since Halloween," Violet said, licking her lips nervously. Her mouth was incredibly dry. "When I saw you drink that potion Professor Snape brought, I knew what it was. He let me help make it." "Did he?" said Lupin with a weak chuckle. His head drooped once more. "Yes, that sounds like him. I suppose I should be grateful Severus hasn't accidentally blurted it out in the middle of class yet." "But what does it matter?" said Violet, taking a step toward Professor Lupin, who once again looked up at her in surprise. "What do you mean? What does it matter? Why didn't I know you before now? You're only a werewolf 12 days a year. What about the rest of the time? Why didn't you ever write or visit, or why didn't you take care of me like you promised? What could I have given you that you didn't already have?" Lupin said, finally straightening up to face her. I had no money to support you with, no house fit for children to be in. Albus insisted that you and Harry be raised away from magic for your own protection, and my presence would have only complicated things. You didn't need me intruding on your normal, comfortable life. Your aunt and uncle have looked after you, loved you, seen that you were taken care of. They didn't love us," Violet said harshly, and Lupin blinked at her surprise. "They've never loved us. Aunt Petunia hates magic. She hates having us in the house. We never even knew we were wizards until Hagrid showed up at the shack to take us away to Diagon Alley." "Shack," Lupin said sharply. What shack? The little shack in the middle of the ocean Uncle Vernon took us to get away from the letters, Violet said, when Hogwarts was trying to tell us who we were. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia didn't want us to know. They wanted to keep us locked in that cupboard forever so we'd never find out what we were, locked in the Violet. What are you? The cupboard where we slept, shouted Violet at the top of her lungs. The cupboard under the stairs where they kept us, locked us in, for days and days at a time because we were bad, or in the way, or because they felt like it. They kept us in there in the dark, and they never told us about magic or our parents or any of it. And we weren't allowed to ask questions because they'd hit us if we did. And we couldn't talk to anyone or tell anyone what they were doing to us or we'd be in more trouble. And Harry and I thought they were the only family we had. We waited for you. We prayed and begged and dreamed for someone to come and take us away from the Dursleys because we knew it wasn't fair to live like that. We waited, and Yao never came. Nobody ever came for us. And every year we get sent back to it, back Tartham, so they can shout at us and hurt us and lock us in and put bars on our windows and shut us away again. And nobody ever came to help us. It was like a dam had broken inside of her. After a lifetime of plugging and patching and cleaning up any little leaks, the whole thing had finally crumbled from the overwhelming weight of emotion behind it. She was crying so hard she couldn't see, and every new crack in her voice hurt more than the last. Violet was shaking all over. She couldn't breathe save for the sharp, shallow gasps she managed to suck in between the sobs that racked her thin shoulders. Professor Lupin looked stricken. Violet, his throat worked soundlessly for a long moment. I am so sorry. I didn't know you should have, Violet spat with all the venom she could muster. Yao should have known. Yao should have been there to look after us, to protect us. Professor Lupin flinched as though Violet had reached out and slapped him. Part of her wanted to. Part of her wanted to make him feel even the tiniest fraction of the pain she had felt and was still feeling. But that pain had become unbearable now. Violet had ripped away the last shackle of control the Dursleys had over her with her bare hands, and now she felt raw and bloody and exposed. She felt a terrible vulnerability as she stood there, the horrific truth of her childhood hanging in the air between herself and Professor Lupin. It was too much. Ither too much. Lupin shouted something after her as Violet turned and ran, wrenching the door open in a blind fury. She didn't hear what he said, didn't care and didn't wanto care. All she wanted to do was run away again, and that's exactly what she did. Chapter 15. Lupin's Regret. The next morning, Violet did not rise with the other girls in her dormitory. She remained in bed, curtains drawn tight around her, and listened silently as all the other girls got dressed around her. She didn't attend breakfast or lunch and still hadn't moved from beneath the covers by the time evening began to roll around. The tears had been coming almost non-stop. Violet's pillow was wet, but her eyes were dry and grainy. She'd had only a few moments of peace after waking up that morning, groggy and oblivious, before the memories of the night before all came rushing back in at once. Her confrontation with Professor Lupin and all the long-buried truths that had come out of him flooded her mind, and Violet began to cry at once. The terrible anger that had taken over her last night had long since faded. Now there was only a deep, lingering pain, a bruise on her soul, too far beneath the surface for her to massage it away. Violet felt wounded. Yesterday had been terribly draining. First, the whole mess with Tracy, which Violet was too emotionally exhausted to even begin thinking how to go about resolving, and then the fear of being caught by Professor Snape, and topping it all off with the revelation about Professor Lupin and all the information she'd revealed to him. What would Harry say if he found out she'd gone and blabbed the truth about life with the Dursleys? He was the one who always thought they should be strong and silent together, tough it out to stop anyone from worrying about them. Harry hadn't wanted to talk to the Minister of Magic or Professor Dumbledore or even Ron and the rest of the Weasleys about what they went through at the hands of Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia. Harry and Violet had been taught, over and over, to keep their mouths shut, and Violet had always followed her brother's lead in thinking that was for the best. Would he be angry with her for breaking that silence? If asked about it, would he call her a liar and try to keep acting like everything was fine? Violet was in the beginning stages of an oncoming panic attack when the dormitory door creaked open. "Potter!" Violet lifted her head. That wasn't Tracy's voice, or any of the other girls she knew belonged in the dormitory. Whoever it belonged to took a few steps into the room and said, louder, "Violet Potter, are you in here?" "Why, yes," Violet said, quickly sitting up and wiping her face. She peered out from between the curtains around her bed and found the new fifth-year prefect, Zoe Accrington, standing in the doorway. The older girl looked at her with raised eyebrows. "Have you been in here all day?" "No," Violet lied. "What do you want?" Zoe's eyes flashed knowingly, but she didn't pry further. "Professor Snape has been looking for you," she said. "He's waiting in the common room." Violet's blood ran cold. "Why?" "I didn't ask," said Zoe mildly. "You'd better hurry and get dressed. He's not one to be kept waiting." She turned and left the dormitory, closing the door behind her and leaving Violet alone once more, frozen in bed. Why would Professor Snape be looking for her? Was he still angry about yesterday? Kicking the blankets off herself and yanking the curtains open, Violet jumped to her feet and got dressed. She tried to smooth her hair down to little effect and forced herself to take several deep, calming breaths before opening the door and climbing the staircase into the common room. Emerging from the stairs, Violet felt eyes on her from all sides. Zoe was seated with some other students by the window. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle were gathered in their usual place in front of the fire, as well as a few second years dotted around the tables at the edges of the room. All of them were silent, watching as Violet slowly stepped out into the common room. "Miss Potter," said Professor Snape, and Violet's attention snapped to him, standing ominously next to the bulletin board, the unmistakable cause for the tension and silence in the room. "With me?" Still feeling the half-dozen sets of eyes boring in her back, Violet had no choice but to quickly follow Professor Snape out into the corridor. He didn't look back to make sure she was following, nor did he keep a pace that was easy for Violet to keep up with. She had to take 2 steps for every long stride Snape made, and was starting to feel winded by the time they reached the entrance hall. But instead of leading her across it to the other side of the dungeons, as Violet expected, Professor Snape immediately turned and headed up the marble staircase. A sick feeling began to bubble in the pit of Violet's stomach. She didn't know where she was being taken, but it felt as though she were being led to the gallows. Their destination didn't become clear until Snape took a sharp turn down a corridor on the 3rd floor and stopped abruptly in front of a great, gleaming griffin statue. "Shock ho chock," snapped Professor Snape, and the griffin leapt aside to reveal a familiar, slowly rotating spiral staircase, which he gestured for Violet to step onto. She did, and Snape followed, and in silence they rode up to the great oak doors that were the entrance to the office of Headmaster Albus Dumbledore. Violet felt as though she had a hummingbird in her chest in place of a heart, flapping its little wings to try and beat its way out of her ribcage. She'd only been brought to Dumbledore's office twice before, and both of those visits were because something really urgent and horrible had happened. Had Dumbledore been told about them sneaking off to Hogsmeade? Was she about to be expelled? But then Professor Snape pushed the doors open without knocking, and Violet saw Professor Lupin sitting in a chair in front of Dumbledore's desk, and she realized that expulsion was the absolute least of her worries. "Hello, Violet," said Professor Dumbledore, smiling kindly at her from behind his enormous, claw-footed desk. "I'm glad that you were able to join us. Thank you, Severus, for bringing her. You may go enjoy the feast." Professor Snape didn't move. He was staring at Professor Lupin, looking suspiciously between him and Dumbledore. Lupin, Violet had to admit, looked terrible. Despite the shabbiness of his robes, during lessons he always managed to look very confident and put together. There was nothing confident about the man now hunched forward in his chair, hands white and shaking as they were clasped tightly in front of him, hair unkempt and covering his eyes. He looked on the verge of shaking himself apart. "What is this about?" Snape asked, looking straight at Dumbledore, who simply smiled back at him. "Nothing to concern yourself with, Severus," said Professor Dumbledore. "Professor Lupin has expressed some concern about Violet's recent classwork. That is all." Professor Snape held his ground, which seemed to require a great deal of effort on his part. "What is there to be concerned about?" he asked in a clipped voice. "Miss Potter is a model student, and as she is a member of my house, I believe I should have been made aware if there were any. Let him stay." For a moment, Violet didn't register the statement as coming from Professor Lupin. It was a rough, hollow sort of voice, and not at all what she associated with the man hunched before her. Dumbledore gave him a long, searching look, then glanced at Professor Snape and nodded. "Very well," Professor Dumbledore said softly. "Close the door, please, Severus, if you would." Snape was also giving Lupin a hard, searching sort of look. Violet was wrong. He'd not looked suspicious before, merely curious. No, looked suspicious. Professor Snape was very hesitant to turn around as well, as if he didn't want the room to be at his back as he closed the heavy oak doors with a dull thud. Not for the first time, Violet felt as though were being sealed inside of a tomb. "Violet!" She looked up. Professor Dumbledore was smiling at her now, a thin hand extended toward the empty seat beside Professor Lupin. Violet gulped. In the few steps that it took for her to cross and room and gingerly sink into the handsome wooden chair, Violet's stomach had twisted itself into a half-dozen intricate sailor's knots, and her heartbeat had reached a pace that she was certain wasn't healthy. But Professor Lupin did not stir as she approached. Now that she was closer to him, she could hear his breathing as well, ragged and shallow. He was clenching his hands together so tightly it was a wonder he hadn't broken his fingers. "Shall I draw you up a chair, Severus?" asked Professor Dumbledore, raising his wand slightly. "I'll stand," Professor Snape said shortly, and he lowered it once more. Dumbledore folded his hands in front of him on top of the desk and turned his full attention to Violet, bright blue eyes gleaming over the rims of his half-moon spectacles. "How are you feeling, my dear?" he asked simply. Violet opened her mouth to reply. Only instead of saying, "Fine," like she meant to, the only sound that came out was a very faint, very frightened squeak. She closed her mouth again and bit down hard on the inside of her lip. "I realize you must be very confused, being called up here like this," said Professor Dumbledore, not unkindly. "I want to assure you that you are not in any sort of trouble, nor is anything the matter, Violet. No one is hurt or in danger. You are completely safe." With Lupin having a meltdown beside her and Professor Snape hovering just out of view behind her back, Violet didn't feel very safe at all. Rather, she knew that Professor Dumbledore would never let her come to harm under his watch, but she did not feel comfortable in her current predicament. She couldn't say any of this, however, even if she felt brave enough to speak, which she didn't. Her throat was now doing a funny sort of spasm that felt like it might close up if she tried to talk again. So she sat, silent and very anxious, and waited for someone to tell her what was going on. Professor Dumbledore must have been able to read her thoughts. He looked intently at her for another moment before mercifully averting his gaze. "I've just finished speaking with Professor Lupin about the conversation you two shared last night," said Professor Dumbledore quietly, glancing over his glasses at Lupin, who still did not move. "He came to me in a state of upset regarding certain things that you said to him, Violet. Certain things that were revealed. I haven't told anyone," Violet heard herself whisper through her white, shaking lips. She wasn't sure if anyone had heard her until Professor Lupin raised his head, just enough to see his eyes beneath his hair. "About what about you? And I swear I won't. I swear," her words failed her again. Violet dropped her eyes to floor. There was a tiny, soft red feather on the floor at the base of Dumbledore's desk, and she fixated on it to keep herself from falling completely to pieces. There was another long, nervous silence. "While that is very reassuring to hear," Professor Dumbledore said gently, "it is not the matter that I have called you here to discuss." "What is this about, Albus?" Snape said suddenly, his voice so close and loud that Violet couldn't help but flinch. Dumbledore raised a hand, though whether to soothe her or admonish Professor Snape, Violet wasn't sure. She honed in on the little feather on the floor so she wouldn't have to meet all the eyes that she could now feel on her. "Violet," said Professor Dumbledore, "do you know why it is you're here? I'm sorry for this. It is not my wish to upset you. But I'm afraid that what has been shared cannot go unaddressed. Would you be more comfortable if your brother were to be H?" "No," Violet gasped, shaking her head so hard it made her dizzy. "Don't bring Harry into it. Please." "All right," Professor Dumbledore said placidly, folding his hands in front of himself once more. "Then know that whatever is shared in this office will not go beyond Professor Lupin, Professor Snape, and myself. You are not in any trouble at all, Violet. Please remember that." "Then why am I here?" said Violet, tearing her gaze from the feather to confront Dumbledore's stare directly. "What do you want from me?" "I would like to know the truth," said Dumbledore. "Perhaps even some truths that you may not be comfortable sharing or find too painful. I would like, whenever you are ready, for you to tell me about life with your aunt and uncle." Violet blinked. "What about it? Professor Lupin says you spoke to him about your family. What he heard from you raised enough concerns for him to seek me out. I am concerned as well by what was relayed to me. I would like to ask you some questions, Violet, if I may." Violet didn't know why he was asking for her permission. It wasn't really like she could say no the headmaster of the school, no matter how badly she wanted to. "What do you want to know?" she asked numbly. Professor Dumbledore gave her a measured, searching look. "Do you get along with your aunt and uncle?" "No," Violet said. "What about your cousin?" "Not really." "Do you look forward to seeing your family during the summer holidays?" "No, sir." "Why not?" Violet didn't answer. She wanted to go back to looking at the feather, but was afraid to drop Professor Dumbledore's gaze. It was a compulsion now to keep eye contact. "Are you happy at home, Violet?" "Hogwarts is my home," she said without thinking, and at once knew it to be the truth. The house on Privet Drive had stopped feeling like home years ago, ever since they first laid eyes on the castle. She knew that wasn't what Professor Dumbledore had meant, but it was truth. "What about the home you share with your aunt and uncle?" Dumbledore pressed gently. "Are you happy there?" "No." "Do you feel safe there?" Again, Violet didn't answer. Professor Dumbledore settled back in his seat, fingers steepled in front of him, and regarded her. Violet decided she didn't care for being regarded. She swallowed and forced herself not to look down at the feather. "When Professor Lupin came to me, he presented the concern that Harry and yourself might be unsafe in your family's home," said Professor Dumbledore, "and cited several examples of worrying behavior you told him about. Do you know what I'm talking about, Violet?" She should have kept her mouth shut. She should have kept her big, stupid mouth shut and kept her temper in check, and none of this would be happening. If she'd done that, then she wouldn't be sitting here right now, dodging softball questions about her home life and feeling like her chest was about to collapse in on itself. "Yes," she said quietly. Violet had to blink hard several times to clear the tears from her eyes. Dumbledore was still watching her calmly, staring. Violet wasn't sure if he had blinked at all since she'd sat down. "You told Professor Lupin that your aunt and uncle have hit you," Professor Dumbledore said seriously. "Is this true?" Violet didn't trust herself to speak. Instead, she jerked her head in a way that she hoped was understood as a nod. "And have they denied you meals as well?" Violet shrugged unhelpfully. The ringing sound was starting in her ears again, only this time it was very far away, like it was being carried to her on the wind. "Have you ever told anyone about this treatment, my dear?" "Yes," Violet mumbled. Beside her, for the first time since she had sat down, Professor Lupin stirred. "Who?" he rasped, in that same small voice as before. He lifted his head enough that Violet could see the rest of his face. The circles beneath his eyes looked even darker than usual, and the rest of his face was blotchy and pale. It was obvious he'd been crying too. "Teachers, muggles at our old school, but they didn't believe us." "And Fudge," Violet said tonelessly. "The minister, I mean." I assume this was when Cornelius encountered Harry and yourself in Diagon Alley, Professor Dumbledore asked, and Violet nodded jerkily once more. After we ran. He asked why, and you told him it was because your family had struck you. And no, not exactly. Violet squirmed uncomfortably. But I told. She glanced quickly over her shoulder, where she assumed Professor Snape was still lurking just out of her peripheral vision, but didn't say anything more. Dumbledore looked up over the top of Violet's head. Severus, he said quietly. Did you know about this? I had my suspicions, said Professor Snape at once, when Miss Potter arrived in my class with noticeable bruising on her face. She confirmed to me that her uncle was responsible for it. Lupin made a noise beside her, a low sort of moan. Professor Dumbledore's expression was as unreadable now as it ever was, but some of the warmth had gone out of his eyes as he stared at Professor Snape. And why did you not bring this to my attention? Getting smacked around never killed anyone, said Professor Snape stiffly. Severus. Breathed Professor Lupin, sounding horror-struck. Violet still couldn't see Snape, but she heard him shift behind her. Besides, I assumed you were already aware of the situation, Headmaster. I was under the impression the Potters were being kept under a close watch. Surely such mistreatment would have been noticed before now. A tense silence hung in the office. Violet, unable to take it any more, finally dropped her eyes back to the feather on the floor. It was right where she'd left it, slightly crooked and coated in a fine layer of dust. She tried to count how many soft little barbs were running up each side. Violet! Professor Dumbledore's voice prompted her to look back up before she'd counted past a dozen. His wrinkled brow was furrowed as he looked at her. How long has this been going on? Violet shrugged again and said, Always, I suppose. Professor Lupin made the noise again and pitched forward in his seat. Violet thought he might fall, but instead he caught himself on his knees, curling in on himself. I should have been there, Lupin moaned, voice muffled and broken. I should have known. I should have been. I did tell you that it might be good for the children to see you, Remus, Dumbledore said calmly, and Professor Lupin's head shot up once more. You didn't tell me they were being abused, Albus, he shouted. How much did you know about this? Why wasn't I told? I offered to keep you informed of Harry and Violet's lives, Remus, and you repeatedly told me. You know damn well that's not what I mean, Lupin growled, leaning forward to rest an arm on Dumbledore's desk. I would have done anything to help them if I'd known what was happening, and you know that. I do know that, said Professor Dumbledore quietly. I am not the one you ought to be making such assurances to, Remus. Professor Lupin's hand clenched into a tight, shaking fist on top of Dumbledore's desk. His breathing was hard and ragged, and Violet couldn't stop herself from flinching when he turned his head toward her. Professor Lupin turned in his seat to face her fully. Violet. He started, but paused immediately. Violet watched his throat work furiously, and the way his shoulders trembled anything to avoid meeting his eyes. Lupin wet his lips and tried again. When Lily and James named me your godfather, it was the happiest moment of my entire life. To be given that trust and responsibility it was very touching, but also overwhelming. I was young, we were all very young, and when they passed away, there was no question that you and Harry should be sent to live with your remaining relatives. They were your family, you should have. You should have been safe with them, and for all this time I assumed that you were. But I suppose I didn't know that. It's true that Albus offered to keep me informed, an offer which I declined out of a desire, perhaps misguidedly so, to protect you. You know, Violet, that I'm a Lupin paused a moment, throat working painfully as he swallowed, that I am afflicted with lycanthropy. Even barring all other circumstances, it was never possible for me to care for you and your brother in any kind of meaningful way. And I thought that my presence would be, well, confusing, for lack of a better word. I'm not a blood relative, and clearly I don't belong in the nice sort of Muggle neighborhood where your aunt and uncle live. I reasoned to myself that it would be too complicated to explain who I was, why I wasn't able to be there for you, why I wouldn't be available at all during certain times. I convinced myself that you didn't need me. I really thought that I was doing the right thing by staying out of your lives, but now Professor Lupin's head fell forward again. He took several deep, slow breaths before looking up once more, looking imploring at Violet. If I had known, or even thought for a moment that you were unhappy or being mistreated, I would have done everything in my power to make you safe. I would never have left you and Harry alone with those people if I didn't believe that you were being cared for and loved the way your parents would have wanted. And now that I know, things will never go back to the way they were. Violet, I promise you. I promise. There was a faint, distant sound of breaking glass, and Violet's world shattered down around her. Don't you dare tell anyone, don't talk about family business, don't you say a word to anyone about what goes on in this house. Keep your mouth shut, or I'll shut it for yow. You'll keep quiet, and keep out of the way if you know what's good for yow. Don't you breathe a word. Violet. Professor Dumbledore's voice sounded very far away. Violet looked at him, but it was like she was seeing through somebody else's eyes, or perhaps her own, only not through them but behind them. Someone was breathing very fast and hard, and she supposed it must have been herself, only she couldn't feel any of the air going in and out of her lungs. Nor could she feel the heart that surely must still be beating in her chest. Violet! It was a new voice speaking, not Dumbledore, and it was closer. Violet tried to find the source of it, and were they hers? Eyes landed on the crumpled form of a man in the chair beside her. His clothes were very shabby and his eyes were very kind, and he was holding out a hand in front of him as though he meant for her to take it. Breathe, Violet, he was saying. His words sounded as though they were coming to her through a pane of thick glass. In and out. Deep breaths in. And out. In. She didn't know how the man expected her to have any control over the breathing of the body that may or may not have been hers at the moment, but she tried to focus on his words anyways. They seemed very meaningful. There you go, he said, reaching toward her again. Violet wanted to shriek, to jolt backward out of his grasp, to do anything she could to get away, but the point where his hand connected with hers didn't hurt the way she expected it to. It didn't hurt at all, not even a little bit. It was warm. It was hesitant and very gentle, and the shock of it was enough to draw Violet's senses back to her. She focused on that warmth, like she had focused on the feather, and forced herself to recall where she was, piece by piece. Hogwarts, the headmaster's office. She was sitting in a chair. The man beside her, the one holding her hand and making her remember how to breathe, was called Professor Lupin. He was her defense against the dark arts teacher. He was her godfather. Violet shut her eyes and drew in a deep breath through her nose. She raised her head, exhaled slowly through her mouth, and then she was back. Back in her body, back in the moment, and back to the situation at hand. She opened her eyes and looked up at Professor Lupin, who was watching her so carefully and held such love in his tired eyes, the kind of love that she had never, ever seen from anyone besides Harry, and Violet began to cry. At once, Professor Lupin left his chair and wrapped his arms around her. Everything that had been missing from Violet's childhood was immediately found in that hug. She'd been hugged before, of course, by Harry and her friends. But those hugs, she realized now, could never compare to this tender, paternal embrace. All the years of absent affection and purposeful neglect, the starvation, the isolation, the endless put-downs and shut-ups and cruel comments in a single moment, Professor Lupin took all of that away and replaced it with warmth and care and kindness. Violet wanted to hug him back. Desperately, she wanted to put her arms around him and make him stay there with her so that she would never be cold or hurt or alone ever again. But all she found herself capable of doing was sitting there and bawling her eyes out. "I've got you," Lupin was murmuring over and over as he rocked her. "I've got you now. I've got you." It was a long, long time before he let her go. It took ages for Violet to cry herself out, even with all the crying she'd already done that day. She didn't know how long they'd been like that, Lupin holding her while she sobbed and shook, unable to reciprocate, but it felt like years had passed by the time he finally released her. The feeling of warmth and safety flowed out of Violet at once. She was exhausted. But Professor Dumbledore was still sitting calmly behind his desk. Was it her imagining, or were his eyes gleaming more than usual? And Professor Snape was still standing silently behind her, and even though Violet felt like she'd just endured years of emotional labor, no more than a few minutes could have actually passed. She hiccuped painfully and clapped a hand over her mouth. With a silent wave of his wand, Professor Dumbledore produced a glass of water on the desk in front of her. Violet only hesitated a moment before taking it and gulping down a healthy mouthful. It was cold and fresh, and she drained half the glass in one go before setting it back on the desk. She hiccuped again. Even worse, her stomach let out a loud, unmistakable gurgle. The sound of chuckling made Violet look up and find Professor Dumbledore smiling softly at her. "I believe there's been enough emotional turmoil for one evening, HM," he said. "We've been keeping dear Violet from her dinner." Violet ducked her head to try and hide how red her face had become, but it was too late for that. She took the handkerchief that Dumbledore had previously offered and quickly dyed her eyes and cheeks with it. "Have you got another one of those, Albus?" said Professor Lupin, nodding at the handkerchief, and a moment later Professor Dumbledore handed him one as well. Violet had never seen a grown man cry like that before. It was oddly comforting to know that her tears weren't just the product of her being a silly little girl who couldn't get a handle on her emotions. "You must be quite hungry as well, Remus," Dumbledore said, looking now at Professor Lupin. "Why don't the two of you go on ahead and enjoy the feast together? I'm sure the time spent walking will do you both some good." Professor Lupin stood up and offered Violet a hand, and she too got unsteadily to her feet. Her legs felt like jelly, but they held firm beneath her. "Severus, would you stay a moment, please?" said Professor Dumbledore, as they all headed toward the door. "I'd like a word." Violet had almost forgotten Professor Snape was in the room. He'd been standing so quietly and so perfectly out of her line of sight that, in the haze of her breakdown, she'd sort of looked right through him. But she didn't miss the way his shoulders went rigid when the headmaster called for him to stay, nor did she fail to notice the way he wouldn't meet her gaze, even when she was so obviously seeking it. "Of course, headmaster," he said quietly, and turned back around without looking at either Violet or Professor Lupin. She resisted the urge to look over her shoulder as they left the grand office and headed back down the spiraling staircase. If Professor Dumbledore expected the long walk down the great hall to be a good opportunity for godfather and goddaughter to talk, he was mistaken. There were plenty of things that Violet wanted to say to Lupin. Hundreds of questions filled her mind about his life, about her parents, about what exactly was going to happen now that everything was out in the open. But every time she started to open her mouth, the words would die on the tip of her tongue. She was certain Professor Lupin was feeling the same way. They were on the second-floor landing when she heard his breath catch in his throat, as though he was about to start a conversation, but nothing came of it. The two of them walked in a silence that was neither awkward nor companionable, and didn't say a single word until Violet came to a stop in the middle of the entrance hall. The sounds of the evening meal were echoing loudly from behind the closed doors. "Don't say anything to Harry," Violet said, and Professor Lupin looked at her curiously. "I should be the one to tell him. I'm the one who worked it all out and then spilled the truth about everything. If you're trying to talk to him about it, he won't understand, and he'll try to cover it all up. But if he hears it from me, please just let me handle my brother." "I wasn't aware Harry was in need of handling," said Professor Lupin mildly. "He is," Violet said at once. "He's an idiot." Lupin let out a startled laugh. "Well, I suppose I won't say a word to him, or I may have to tell him you said that." "Oh, he knows," said Violet, flashing a brief, crooked smile. Lupin returned it, though she could still see the worry in his eyes. Violet turned back toward the closed doors to the great hall and took a deep breath. For good measure, she rubbed her face with the back of her hand. "Can you tell that I've been crying?" Lupin gave her a polite once-over and said, "No." "Can you tell Thaddeus?" She peered up at his thin, prematurely lined face. The dark circles were still prominent under his eyes, and his hair could use a quick comb, but he hadn't asked about any of that. Violet shook her head. Professor Lupin smiled again. "Then, shall we?" When the doors to the great hall opened, Violet half expected the room to go quiet. In a split-second nightmare, she saw all the faces of all the students and teachers turning toward her, as though they were able to tell that her whole world had been irrevocably altered. But no one was looking at all as she stepped into the hall behind Professor Lupin. Everybody was too focused on the plates of food in front of them, on the conversation with their friends, on their own little lives to be paying any attention to Violet. But at the Slytherin table, Tracy and Cass greeted her with wide eyes and smiles. "Where have you been?" Cassius asked, leaning across the table toward her. "I haven't seen you since yesterday." "Tracy said you ran off, and we've been hearing all sorts of nonsense from Malfoy." Violet shot a nervous look across the table at Tracy. They hadn't spoken at all since the awkwardness in the garden, and Violet feared that she would find some of that firm distance still in Tracy's eyes. But there was nothing there but warmth and worry. That ought to have been comforting, but it made Violet feel oddly sad. "I'm fine," she said quietly, flashing a nervous smile. "Sorry for making you worry. I'm fine, Cass." "What did Snape want?" asked Tracy. "He came around asking where to find you, but I said I didn't know." "Are you in trouble, Violet?" Violet shook her head. Quite the contrary, she felt as though all her troubles had melted away. She shot a surreptitious glance toward the high table just in time to see Professor Lupin settling into his seat, smiling mildly at Professor McGonagall. He must have felt Violet's eyes on him because he turned his head and looked right back at her. The smile on his face broadened, and Violet couldn't help but smile back. "No," she said quietly, turning back to Cassius and Tracy, who were now looking at her in confusion. "No, I'm not in trouble at all. I think things are going to be all right now, actually. Better than they've been in a long time. You don't have to worry, really." Tracy and Cass looked at one another uncertainly, clearly unconvinced, and Violet leaned forward and said, "I'll tell you tonight, all right. For now, let's just eat, yeah. I'm starved." While she'd expected her friend's curiosity, Violet hadn't anticipated being literally cornered as soon as they all set foot in the Slytherin common room. Tracy and Cassius practically herded her over to their usual small table and brought their chairs around to sit close on either side of her, boxing Violet in while making sure that nobody could overhear them. There, in hushed whispers and giddy, nervous stammers, Violet explained everything that had been said and done between the night's feast and yesterday afternoon. She omitted certain details in her retelling the nature of the Marauders' map, which Cass still didn't know about, the specifics of the Dursleys' mistreatments of her and Harry, Professor Snape's odd comments, Lupin's condition, but told them all the most important bits. Professor Lupin was her godfather. He was going to be in her life from now on. Dumbledore knew what was going on at the Dursleys' house. Violet had, for the very first time in her life, found another person she could call family. It was very difficult for Violet to open up so completely to Cassius and Tracy. Whereas Harry had always blurted everything right out to Ron and Hermione, even if it was absolutely off their business, Violet had a habit of keeping her private thoughts and experiences much closer to her chest. She didn't want to bother or upset people with her problems, especially when she was perfectly capable of dealing with them on her own, but the more she spoke now, the lighter she felt, as though a weight was being lifted from her shoulders. It was all so new and fresh and wonderful for her, and Violet expected her friends to share that excitement. So it shocked her when Cassius, frowning deeply, said, "So that's it, is it?" "What's it?" Violet asked, wide-eyed. "He thinks he can just waltz into your life now and act like everything's fixed. How's that fair?" "We've been at school 4 months," Tracy said, also frowning now. "You've been taking lessons with Lupin outside of class. He's had plenty of time to tell you and Harry the truth. He should have said something the very first night. It's not that simple," said Violet quickly. He was scared, I think. I mean, it's been years, and that's another thing, Cass said angrily. You and Harry have spent 12 bloody years with those muggles, and where's Lupin been? You just said Dumbledore tried to make him reach out to you, and he said no, and he didn't even come and tell you in the end. You worked it out all by yourself without him saying a word. Well, I know, but and what's his excuse for it? Said Tracy, eyes narrowed in suspicion. Did he even give you one? What could have been more important than looking after you and Harry? Ick knew there was something off about him, Cass snarled, and the viciousness of his tone shocked Violet. Those shabby robes, and all the scars on him, you've seen his hands. How torn up they are, I'd bet anything he's been into some sort of nasty business before coming to Hogwarts. Stop it, Violet said loudly, slamming her balled fists down onto her own legs, hard enough to bruise. Tracy and Cass looked at her in surprise. Just stop it, all right. You don't know anything about it or what he's been through. And you do, Cass challenged. You've only just met the man, Romans 6. What Ishi's excuse then? It's none of your business, that's what it is, Violet snapped. This was all wrong. Her friends were supposed to be happy for her. This wasn't meant to be a fight. Couldn't they see how important this was? Cassius sat back in his seat and crossed his arms over his chest, glaring expectantly at her, and Tracy was fidgeting nervously with one of her bracelets. Violet took a deep breath and tried to regain some of her composure. Look, she said after a moment, then paused. Her tone still sounded too aggressive. She tried again. You're not asking any questions that I haven't already put to Professor Lupin, and he's answered me honestly. I can't tell you what his why hasn't been there until now, and I'm sorry, but it's important. I was angry, too. I am angry, and I still have a lot of questions I want to ask him, but tears were pricking at the corners of her eyes again. Violet quickly wiped them away. But I don't want you two to be angry with Mephorm, she said shakily. He's already said he's sorry for being gone and promised to be here now, and I've never had that before, you know. First, Harry and I thought our aunt and uncle were the only family we had, and then we learned about Sirius Black, and somehow that was us. And I didn't think we'd get anybody else who could look after us, but now Lupin is here, and I really think that things are going to be okay, all right. I'm happy, and I wanted you to be happy for me, too. Violet sniffled wetly and scrubbed at her eyes again. She really ought to have been out of tears at this point, she thought, but somehow they kept coming. Tracy's chair creaked slightly as she leaned forward and rested a hand on Violet's back. I'm sorry, Violet, she said quietly. We didn't mean to upset you. Sorry, Cass muttered after a moment. He ran a hand through his short, sandy hair. It's none of our business, I suppose, but we're worried for you, that's all. He dropped his eyes to the floor as two faint pink spots appeared on his cheeks. I don't want to see you get hurt any more, you know. Violet's heart welled with affection for her friends. She understood their anger and suspicion. Really, she did. Violet herself had felt it all for herself just the day before, and some of it still roiled inside of her, waiting to be processed and dealt with. But it was their compassion she needed. It was a lot to ask when she couldn't give them all the answers they needed to make peace with Professor Lupin. There was no way Violet could tell Cassius and Tracy his secret, no matter how hurt or angry they became. It wasn't hers to share, even though it could explain so much. As hard as this conversation had been, at least it was practice for things to come. Harry had to be told as well, a prospect Violet was not looking forward to. Her own anger burned white-hot and wreaked havoc on both her mental state and anything fragile that was unfortunate enough to be close to her when the rage hit. But Harry's anger could sit within him like a sickness, festering and growing until it burst from every pore and tore him apart from the inside out. Violet would have vetoed tell her brother that Lupin was a werewolf. Harry just wouldn't understand otherwise. Without that context, he wouldn't be able to forgive Professor Lupin for leaving them alone for all these years, and even with the truth he might not be satisfied. Violet could only hope to catch Harry at a time when he wasn't distracted and would be able to listen to reason. Chapter 16. The Quidditch Final. Violet dashed down early to breakfast the next morning, determined to pull Harry aside and have him to herself for a few minutes. There was so much she needed to tell him and so little time for it. She didn't care if Ron scowled at her when she dragged Harry away. Not everything had to involve him. Waiting outside the double doors of the great hall, Violet practically skipped over to the bottom of the grand staircase when she saw her brother coming down it. "I need to talk to you," they both said at the same time, then blinked in shock and said, "You go first." "Bloody hell," Ron grumbled, pushing bodily past the two of them. "It's bad enough with Fred and George." "I'll save you a seat, Harry." Violet glared after Ron as he headed into the great hall. He hadn't looked at her at all, let alone spoken, which made plain his feelings toward her had remained unchanged. "Don't mind him," Harry said, grimacing apologetically at Ron's retreating back. "You go ahead." "You first," Violet said, certain that it would be some news about the nearing Quidditch match, or something to do with Harry's encounter with Malfoy. Surely Harry wouldn't have anything to say that was as important as Watcher planned to tell him. But that confidence wavered at the sight of Harry's expression. He dug something out of the pocket of his robes and pressed it into Violet's hands. "Hagrid wrote to Hermione the other night," Harry said. "He just got back from London, you know, with the committee." He lost the hearing. Bile rose in the back of Violet's throat. She looked down at the letter she'd been given and quickly read, "Dear Hermione, we lost. I'm allowed to bring him back to Hogwarts. Execution date to be fixed. Beaky has enjoyed London. I won't forget all the help you gave us. Hagrid." "They can't do this," said Violet. "They can't. Buckbeak isn't dangerous. Lucius Malfoy's behind it," Harry said darkly, taking the letter back from Violet's shaking hands and tucking it into his robes. "He frightened the committee into it. You've seen what he's like. Hermione reckons they're all a bunch of doddery old fools, and he scared them into it. Listen, there's an appeal, and Hermione's going to help with that as well. Ron and I have promised to help too. Not that I expect it to do any good, but I'll help too," Violet promised at once. "Anything for Hagrid and Buckbeak, of course." Harry sighed in relief, clearly glad he hadn't had to ask her for help. "Thanks, Roman 6, he said softly. "I know it'll mean the world to him no matter what happens. So, your turn." "For what?" "To tell me something," Harry said. It sounded like it must be important. "Oh," Violet drew up short. Yes, it was important, but so was Hagrid. She knew her brother. He was very good at focusing very hard on one thing at a time, and very bad at focusing on several things all at once. If he had already promised his help to Hagrid, then that was going to take up much of his mental and emotional workload. And if she were to dump the bombshell she was carrying on him now, everything would go topsy-turvy. It wasn't fair, she decided, and so Violet shook her head and said, "It can wait. Have you been to see Hagrid yet?" The safety measures imposed on the students since Black's second break-in made it impossible for Harry, Violet, and their friends to go and visit Hagrid outside of class hours. Their only chance of talking to him was during Care of Magical Creatures lessons. He seemed numb with shock at the verdict. "It's all my fault. Got all tongue-tied. They was all sitting there in black robes, and I kept dropping me notes and forgetting all them dates you girls looked up for me." And then Lucius Malfoy stood up and said his bit, and the committee juice did exactly what he told them. "There's still the appeal," Ron said fiercely, surprising Violet. He'd been rather distant about the whole affair with Buckbeak as far as she'd known. "Don't give up yet, we're working on it." They were walking back up the castle with the rest of the class. Tracy, who Violet had spent the week quietly distancing herself from, had already gone on inside alone. Ahead, the four of them could see Malfoy, who was walking with Crabbe and Goyle, and kept looking back, laughing derisively. "Es no good, Ron," said Hagrid sadly, as they reached the castle steps. "That committee's in Lucius Malfoy's pocket. I'm Juice, gonna make sure the rest o' Beaky's time is the happiest he's ever had. I owe him that." Hagrid turned around and hurried back toward his cabin, his face buried in his handkerchief. "Look at him blubber." Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle had been standing just inside the castle doors, listening. "Have you ever seen anything quite as pathetic?" said Malfoy. and he's supposed to be our teacher. Violet's blood boiled. She and Harry both made furious moves toward Malfoy, but Hermione got their first smack. She had slapped Malfoy across the face with all the strength she could muster. Malfoy staggered. Harry, Ron, and Violet stood flabbergasted, Crabbe and Goyle staring stupidly as Hermione raised her hand again. "Don't you dare call Hagrid pathetic, you foul, loathsome, evil little cockroach." "Hermione," said Ron weakly, and he tried to grab her hand as she swung it back. "Get off, Ron." Hermione pulled out her wand. Malfoy stepped backward. Crabbe and Goyle looked at him for instructions, thoroughly bewildered. "Come on," Malfoy muttered, and in a moment all three of them had disappeared into the passageway to the dungeons. "Hermione," Ron said again, sounding both stunned and impressed. "Harry, you better beat him in the Quidditch final," Hermione said shrilly. "You just better had, because I can't stand it if Slytherin wins. No offense, Violet," she added at once, suddenly whirling to fix Violet with a very serious stare. "You're the best of all of them, I hope you know that." Violet, whose mouth was already hanging open in shock, sputtered ineffectively for a moment. "We're doing charms," said Ron, still gargling at Hermione. "We'd better go." The three Gryffindors hurried off together, leaving Violet standing in the entrance hall stunned and alone. Realizing that she would be late for Transfiguration, she hurried up the marble staircase and into Professor McGonagall's classroom. "You're nearly late," whispered Tracy as soon as Violet slid into her seat, just in time for the classroom door to magically shut behind her. "What kept you?" "Talking to Hagrid," Violet whispered back, hurriedly getting supplies out of her bag. On the other side of the aisle, Malfoy sat with Crabbe, shoulders hunched and robes pulled up to try and hide the bright pink splotch Violet could still see spreading across his cheek in a perfect Hermione-shaped handprint. Violet was very careful to keep to her own side of the desk when sitting next to Tracy. She kept her knees together and feet tucked beneath her chair for the whole lesson to avoid accidentally bumping into Tracy, and was, for once, grateful to be left-handed. As her writing arm was on the outside, it meant that she didn't have to worry about the two of them brushing elbows. Tracy hadn't said anything to encourage this behavior. Quite the opposite. She seemed to go out of her way to touch Violet since the incident in the flower garden. Tracy's fingers would brush against Violet's any time they passed something back and forth, and she would scoot closer to her on the bench at meal times, even when there was plenty of room for her to sit farther away. Violet didn't understand it. She was trying to be respectful and keep her distance. The last thing she wanted was for any of her actions or touches to be unwanted or misunderstood. Tracy had been quite clear that the affection she had for Violet was purely friendly, and that was all it would ever be. Violet, who hadn't even known that she'd wanted something more until being rebuffed, was doing her best not to cross any of the new, unspoken boundaries between them, or that chic spectetto be between them. But even on the journey down the great hall for lunch, Tracy tried to loop their arms together, chattering brightly about Professor McGonagall's lecture and the prospect of turning random things around their dorm into rabbits that night. Violet squirmed uncomfortably out of her grasp and nodded along, feeling awkward and slightly queasy as she tried to listen to what Tracy was saying. Violet had hoped to have another chance to speak to Harry at lunch, but to her dismay and annoyance, he didn't make an appearance at the Gryffindor table for the whole meal. In fact, Harry proved to be annoyingly elusive for the rest of the week as well. He put in only the briefest of appearances at mealtimes before dashing off with Ron and Hermione, and their handful of shared lessons didn't leave Violet with enough privacy or time to say everything that needed to be said. She regretted not spilling it all on that first day, and now that the Quidditch final was drawing ever nearer, she was afraid she'd never get the chance to speak to her brother alone. The Easter holidays were not exactly relaxing. The third years had never had so much homework, and Cassius, who would be facing his OW. LS at the end of the year was so busy that Violet and Tracy hardly ever saw him in the common room anymore. He joined a study group with his fellow fifth years. He explained tiredly to them one night, and they had all been meeting in the library for hours at a time to try and prepare themselves for their exams. Even overwhelmed with assignments as she was, Violet was rather glad for the break from their usual classes. It meant that she had more free time to spend with Professor Lupin. Violet wanted to know everything about him and was more than eager to share any information about herself as well. Never before had someone been so interested in her and her opinions, her likes and dislikes, what her fears were and hopes for the future. But despite her eager curiosity, getting information out of Lupin, Violet quickly learned, was like trying to pull teeth with your bare hands. "Where do you live?" she asked, flipping idly through her notes on cheering charms. Violet was seated in front of Professor Lupin's desk while he sat behind it, reviewing his course curriculum for the coming term. Two half-empty bottles of butterbeer sat between them. "You already know that one," Lupin said without looking up, though there was a small smile on his face. "I live here at Hogwarts." "You live here now," Violet pressed. "But what about when you're not teaching?" "I sleep under the desk," said Professor Lupin mildly. I'm afraid Professor Dumbledore was rather misleading when he said all Hogwarts teachers were given their own rooms. "Oh, come on," Violet snorted, half laughter and half exasperation. "You really won't tell me, but I just did." Violet abandoned all pretense of studying and closed her book with a snap. "Fine," she said, scooting closer in her chair. She rested her elbows on the desk and stared at Professor Lupin. "What's the J stand for?" "Excuse me." "In your name." "On the train, your suitcase said Professor R.J. Lupin. So what's the J?" "John," said Professor Lupin. Violet threw her hands up in the air. "All right then, don't tell me anything," she said hotly. "I suppose I'll just sit here in silence and wait to be dismissed for dinner, sir. Then I'll leave, and we can go back to nodding politely at one another in the hallways." Lupin reached across the desk and lightly rested his hand over her own. His eyes were sparkling, and Violet realized he was laughing. "I'm sorry if I'm being difficult," Professor Lupin said. "I don't mean to keep things from you, Violet, but I'm afraid I'm rather unaccustomed to being asked personal questions about my life. It's really not very interesting." "I think it's interesting," Violet insisted. "Sorry, I'm not trying to pry or be awkward or anything, I want to know you. I feel like I should know everything about you already, but I don't, and I just wanted to understand who you are." Professor Lupin's smile turned melancholy. He looked away again and withdrew his hand back to his side of the desk. "That's very kind of you," he said quietly. He was silent for a long moment. "Your mother said something similar to me once. It was many years ago when we were still in school together. Before she and James had even started seeing each other, in fact. We were paired together for some assignment or other. We might have just been sat next to each other. I can't remember. But your mother was one of the few people I've ever had the joy of meeting who went out of her way in life to show kindness to everyone she met and offer them the chance for friendship. She was more than polite to me. She could have half-heartedly asked how I was and left it at that, but instead she asked after my parents and what I'd had for lunch, and whether or not I was looking forward to the weather changing soon, just little questions to show that she really cared about what I had to say. I've often thought the world would be a much brighter place with more lilies in it. Lupin drummed his fingertips lightly on the desk, so lightly they barely made a noise. He seemed lost in thought, or perhaps in memories of the past, of a woman that Violet didn't and would never get the chance to know. She feared that Professor Lupin wouldn't speak any more. But then he raised his eyes to hers once more and smiled and said, "My middle name really is John, by the way." "Oh," Violet said, flushing. It seemed such an ordinary name for a wizard, and she'd been so certain it was another joke, but then again, not everyone could be a Draco or a Hermione, could they? It felt rude to say so out loud, especially when she had already embarrassed herself, so instead Violet asked, "What's mine?" "What's your what?" said Professor Lupin. "My middle name," said Violet. "Professor Vector keeps asking for one for a proper arithmancy reading, but I told her I wasn't sure I have one. Do I?" "Your aunt never told you," Lupin said, an odd expression coming over his face. Violet shook her head. I thought about writing her to ask, but I don't think Aunt Petunia would be very happy to have any more owls turning up on her doorstep. Professor Lupin was staring at her now, frowning slightly, but for once Violet didn't feel like shrinking away the eyes on her. After a moment, Lupin blinked and cleared his throat. Clara, he said quietly. Violet Clara Potter. You were named after your grandmother, I believe, Lily's mother. Violet digested this information with a funny, wobbly sort of feeling in her gut. Not only had she just learned her own middle name Clara, but learned as well that she was named for Somion, her grandmother, another member of her family that she had never and would never know. But to even know of her was a treasure that Violet hadn't even realized she'd been longing for. Did you know my grandparents? She asked, sitting forward in her seat. Professor Lupin shook his head. Unfortunately, no. Not Lily's parents anyway. They attended the wedding, of course, but as I said before, I wasn't able to make the ceremony. Though I did get to meet James's mother and father once or twice, I don't think I'm qualified to give any sort of character reference. I wish. He looked up at Violet apologetically. There was a deep, unexpected sadness in his eyes. I wish I could tell you more, Violet. I really do. But more than that, I wish that I didn't, Avito, tell you anything about your family. All of this should have come from your parents, from Lily and James themselves, or at the very least your aunt. He drummed his fingers on the desk again, more loudly this time. Did she really never tell you and Harry anything? Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia never talk about anyone else in the family, Violet said. From her family, I mean. We've met Dudley's grandparents and Aunt Marge, but nobody ever talks about our parents except to say something nasty. Professor Lupin frowned deeply at that. It made the lines in his young face all the more prominent. Violet decided she didn't care for it. But talking to people like you and Hagrid has helped me and Harry hear a bit more about our parents, she added quickly. And well, Professor Snape brings up our father a lot, but he doesn't have much nice to say about him, does he? Lupin sighed and reached for his bottle of butterbeer. Kind words have never been Severus' strong suit, I'm afraid, said Professor Lupin after taking a long sip. Nor has tact. I've tried to have a word with him about the way he speaks to you too, you know, especially Harry. Violet flushed awkwardly. She hadn't really noticed how differently Professor Snape treated the two of them until people started bringing it up, but it would be foolish to deny it now that it had been pointed out to her. Snape's dislike for her brother was likely as strong for Harry's dislike for him. He keeps saying that Harry is like our dad, Violet said. Professor Lupin shook his head. He's not really, and certainly not the way Severus wants to think he is. I'll admit, Harry has quite the adventurous streak in him, as do you, Violet. Don't think I haven't heard the sort of shenanigans you've gotten yourself into. Violet's whole face went red, and she choked on her butterbeer. But he's a very kind, gentle boy as well. I don't know that Harry has a single bone of meanness in his body. But our dad did, Violet said quickly. Lupin stiffened, as though realizing his misstep. He hesitated for a long moment. Your father was a great man, said Professor Lupin quietly, and it was plain that he was choosing his words carefully, with a heart of gold. He was always quick to laugh, charming and generous and loving toward his friends and family. But he didn't show that side of himself to everyone. James, he paused again. Then, Severus and your father didn't get along from the very moment they met, and that tension was carried between them for many years. Severus never saw the best in James because James never cared to show it to him. Just as Severus never made any attempt to endear himself to James and Well, keeping that in mind, Violet, I think it would be best to take Professor Snape's words with a grain of salt. Violet slowly sipped her butterbeer as she processed what Professor Lupin had said. It was no secret that Snape had disliked her father intensely, though Violet had never really questioned Edwy. It had never really occurred to her that her father might have given Snap a reason to hate him. He saved Professor Snape's life once, she blurted, remembering suddenly. Dumbledore told us, me and Harry, and then Snape said so as well in his office. Our dad pulled a prank that would have killed him, only he chickened out and saved Snape from it at the last minute. Do you know anything about that? Is it true? But Professor Lupin's expression had gone all closed again, and though the sun shining through the window behind him made it difficult to tell, Violet thought he might have gone a little pale. I think that's enough reminiscing for today, Lupin said mildly, downing the last of his butterbeer. Violet wanted to protest, to point out that they'd barely scraped the surface of the topic, but something in his eyes stopped her. Finishing off what was left of her butterbeer as well, Violet packed up her books and parchment and bid Professor Lupin a friendly, if rather awkward, farewell. He clearly knew more about the prank than he was saying, but for whatever happened all those years ago to still be so upsetting to both Snape and Lupin, it must have been really bad. Violet's feet carried her back to the slithering common room, deep in thought. While Violet had spent the last week brainstorming ways of getting Harry away from his friends so she could speak to him in a moment of downtime, it had never occurred to her that he might come and seek her out on her own. She had tucked herself in the back shelves of the library, as far from Madame Pince's desk as she could get, and had just settled down to brush up on her herbology notes when Harry's face appeared between the shelves. "There you are," said Harry quietly. He hurried over and dropped into the armchair beside Violet. "I've been looking for you all morning. Tracy said you might be in the library. What are you doing here by yourself?" "Just fancied a bit of quiet time," Violet said, a slight flush creeping up her neck. That wasn't entirely the truth. She was still trying to keep a polite distance between herself and Tracy, and the library was the best place to hide without actually going into hiding. But explaining that to Harry would have meant explaining Wish was trying to hide. "Why have you been looking for me?" "Is something wrong?" Harry shook his head and said, "Not really. I just wanted to know if Crookshanks was with you all at last night." A spike of anxiety immediately stabbed into Violet's heart. "Why?" she asked, voice high with panic. "Has something happened to him?" "Don't tell me you think he's eaten somebody else's pet." "No, nothing like that," Harry said quickly. "Everything's fine. He hasn't done anything. Only I think I might have seen him on the grounds last night, out by the forest." "Do you let him wander at night?" "Not on purpose." Violet frowned. "He usually sleeps on my feet, but I can't watch him all night." "When did you see him?" "I dunno, late. After midnight." "What were you doing out on the grounds after midnight, Harry?" Violet asked, ready to give her brother a talking to, but Harry was shaking his head again. "It wasn't. I just saw him through the window. He was down by the edge of the forest, and then I think I saw him with the Harry broke off, looking suddenly abashed. He glanced quickly around where they sat as though looking for prying ears, then leaned in close to Violet and whispered, "I saw him with a dog, and I think it might have been the Grim." Violet's mouth fell open. "Thegrim," she hissed in disbelief. "Harry, I thought you didn't believe in any of that." Hermione said, "I know, all right," muttered Harry. "I don't know what I believe, Romans 6, but I know what I saw. Your cat was out last night having a walkabout with a massive black dog, trotting along like they were old pals or something. Have you seen the Grim lately?" "Of course I haven't, but I don't spend as much time outdoors as you do," Violet said. She gnawed uncertainly on the inside of her lip. "And you're sure it was Crookshanks?" "I'm sure it was a big fluffy cat with a face like it'd hit a brick wall at high speed," Harry said, grinning nervously. Violet thwacked him lightly on the arm. "I think he's cute," Violet said primly. Harry snorted. "Yeah, all right, but you also thought flabberworms were really neat, didn't you?" "There in it, Harry. They're disgusting, Violet. Sometimes disgusting things can be neat." "Right, yeah, suit yourself." "I'll just stick with Hedwig, thanks." The two of them glared at each other for a long moment, eyes locked, before collapsing into a fit of muffled giggles. This was the sort of thing that Violet missed most about being in a different house than her brother. The bickering, the silliness, the little looks and expressions that passed between them. These moments had once been as common as breathing, but at Hogwarts they became treasured little gasps of fresh air. "I miss you," Violet found herself saying. She held out her hand for Harry to take. He took it, but for a moment Violet, though he might say some nonsense about not being gone or seeing each other every day, it just wasn't the same. But Harry said, "I miss you too, Romans 6, and she knew he understood. They just sat there for a time, holding hands and enjoying one another's silent company. As rare as these moments were during the school year, they both knew the summer holidays were drawing closer and closer. Soon they would be sent back to the Dursleys, with only each for company, that is, if Aunt Petunia would even have them back in the house. So much had changed since they stormed out. Whatever the outcome, it was very likely that life at Privet Drive would be unrecognizable when they got back. Although there was a little pinprick of hope in Violet's vision of the future. "Harry, there's something I need to tell you," Violet said softly. Harry met her gaze with raised, expectant eyebrows. Violet focused on the warmth of his hand in hers and tried to put the words she wanted to say in order. "You remember what we heard in the Three Broomsticks about Sirius Black?" "How could I forget?" Harry said darkly. "He betrayed our parents. He went to school with them and was supposed to be their friend. He was supposed to be our godfather, your godfather," Violet corrected. "He's your godfather, Harry, not mine. What are you talking about?" "I thought Fudge said, how do you know?" "I know that Black isn't my godfather," Violet said very quickly, before she could talk herself out of it, "because Professor Lupin is." Harry's mouth went slack. "What?" Everything that Violet had been hiding from her brother all seemed to burst forth at once, the words tumbling from her mouth, whether she wanted them to or not. She told Harry about the silver hair comb she'd been given at Christmas, and the picture of their mother with the note to Moony on the back, putting the pieces together between the note, and the map Professor Snape's comment about getting the Marauders map directly from the manufacturers, and the way Lupin had looked when he said it. Violet told Harry about all that, and then about the way she had confronted Professor Lupin and the things she had told him. This was what she had been dreading this last week, telling her brother that she had broken the silent agreement to bury the truth of life with the Dursleys. Neither of them had ever explicitly said that the things they suffered should be kept secret, but after years of covering for each other, making excuses, hiding bruises and wiping away tears before anyone else could see, an understanding had been formed. Things were fine, but now the truth was out. Violet had let it all out at the top of her lungs, and it couldn't be taken back. She expected Harry to be angry with her. She waited for the anger, for the terrible look of betrayal to darken his face. "Were they angry?" Harry asked. Violet blinked. "Who?" "Dumbledore and Professor Lupin." "When you told them, were they mad at you?" There was an edge of nervousness to his face that Violet seldom heard. She slowly shook her head. "No, Lupin was really upset, but not with me. They mostly just seemed." "Well, sad, I suppose. But you didn't get in trouble for talking about it," Harry pressed, giving her hand a squeeze. "And they believed you. They all acted like they did. And Professor Lupin," Violet dropped her voice to a murmur, "he said he's not going to let things back to the way they were. He's going to help take care of us." Harry's eyes went wide. "Can we go and live with him?" he asked breathlessly, but his face fell when Violet shook her head. "Why not? If he's going to be looking after us, Harry, it's really complicated," Violet said firmly. "I can't tell you why. Don't look at me like that. I just can't, but I trust him to keep his word. Everything's going to be different now, I promise, Harry." Harry stared down at their joined hands, a wary expression on his face. Violet could only imagine what was going through her brother's head. The doubts, all the questions he surely had, the answers to which she knew in her heart weren't her place to give him. But he had to trust her. She'd promised, after all. When the holidays came to an end, and all the piles of homework had been turned in, the only thing left on anyone's mind was the outcome of the Quidditch Cup. Slytherin had won the cup 7 years in a row, and with the ferocity of their training and Marcus Flint's penchant for encouraging dirty playing, there was little wonder as to why. It was Flint's last year at Hogwarts, unless he managed to flub all his exams again, and he was determined to push his team to victory for 8 years running. Never, in anyone's memory, had a match approached in such a highly charged atmosphere. By the time the holidays were over, the tensions between the Gryffindors and Slytherins was at the breaking point. A number of small scuffles broke out in the corridors, culminating in a nasty incident in which a Gryffindor fourth year and a Slytherin sixth year ended up in the hospital wing with leaks sprouting out of their ears. Violet was having a particularly bad time of it. The Gryffindors were hostile toward her because she was a Slytherin, and most of the Slytherins regarded her with suspicion because she was Harry's sister and known to support him over maintaining house loyalty. Shoulders bumped her roughly in the corridors, insults and petty threats whispered in her ears and putting her down. But Violet knew she wasn't getting the worst of it. Harry was, by far. He was constantly surrounded by his team and housemates by orders of Oliver Wood to counter any Slytherin attempts to put him out of action. Violet overhead, Malfoy grumbling about it frequently, and was very glad that he hadn't found a moment to catch her brother alone. The day of the match, Harry and the rest of the Gryffindor team entered the great hall to enormous applause, not only from their own house, but from the Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw tables as well. Everyone was itching to see Slytherin knocked down a peg. With so many eyes on her, Violet didn't dare clap for her brother. She caught his eye and grinned encouragingly, but even that earned a few nasty hisses in her direction. Violet thought she might get a chance to wish Harry luck as he left the hall for the pitch, but this was a mistake. A surge of bodies all left the great hall at once, cheering and jeering and chanting in equal measure, and Violet found herself carried along with them, pulled away from Harry by the tide. The next time she saw her brother it was from a distance. Violet, Tracy, and Cassius were all sitting in their customary seats at the very top of the Quidditch stadium, hollering and clapping madly as the two teams met on the field. It must have been an intimidating sight. 3/4 of the crowd was wearing scarlet rosettes, waving scarlet flags with the Gryffindor lions upon them, or brandishing banners with slogans like "Go Gryffindor" and "Lions for the Cup." Behind the Slytherin goal posts, however, 200 people were wearing green. The silver serpent of Slytherin glittered on their flags, and Professor Snape sat in the very front row, wearing green like everyone else, and a very grim smile. "And here are the Gryffindors," yelled Lee Jordan, who was acting as commentator as usual. "Potter, Bell, Johnson, Spinnet, Weasley, and Wood. Widely acknowledged as the best team Hogwarts has seen in a good few years." Lee's comments were drowned out by a tide of boos all around Violet. "And here come the Slytherin team, led by Captain Flint. He's made some chances in the lineup and seems to be going for size rather than skill." More boos from the Slytherin crowd. As much as Violet was inclined to agree with Jordan, Malfoy was easily the smallest person on the Slytherin team. She never cared for much he was allowed to get away with poking fun at the other houses. "Captains, shake hands," said Madam Hooch. "Mount your brooms, 3, 2, 1. The sound of her whistle was lost in the roar from the crowd as 14 brooms rose into the air. Harry shot into the air like a cork, flying high above the rest of his teammates. Among the crowd of fellow Slytherins, Violet's cheers were only for Harry. And it's Gryffindor in possession, Alicia Spinnet of Gryffindor with the quaffle, heading straight for the Slytherin goal posts. "Looking good, Alicia." "Ugh," no quaffle intercepted by Montague of Slytherin tearing up the field. Wham! "Nice bludger work there by George Weasley." Montague drops the quaffle. It's caught by Johnson. Gryffindor back in possession. "Come on." Angelina, nice swerve around Montague duck. Angelina, that's a bludger. She scores. 10-0 to Gryffindor. Angelina Johnson punched the air as she soared around the end of the field. The sea of scarlet below was screaming its delight. Ouch! Angelina was nearly thrown from her broom as Marcus Flint went smashing into her. "Sorry," said Flint as the crowd below booed. "Sorry, didn't see her." A moment later, Fred Weasley chucked his beater's club at the back of Flint's head. Flint's nose smashed into the handle of his broom and began to bleed. "That will do," shrieked Madam Hook, zooming between them. Penalty shot to Gryffindor for an unprovoked on their chaser. Penalty shot to Slytherin for deliberate damage, Tarther Chaser. Come off it, miss, howled Fred, but Madam Hooch blew her whistle and Alicia flew forward to take the penalty. Come on, Alicia, yelled Lee Jordan into the silence that had descended on the ground. Yes, she's beaten the keeper, 20-0 to Gryffindor. Violet held her breath as Flint, still bleeding freely, flew forward to take the Slytherin penalty. Wood was hovering in front of the Slytherin goal posts, his jaw clenched. Course, Wood's a superb keeper, Lee told the crowd as Flint waited for Madam Hooch's whistle. Superb. Very difficult to pass, very difficult indeed, yes. I don't believe it. He's saved it. The groan that went up all around them was loud enough to make Tracy clap her hands over her ears. Gryffindor back in possession, no. Slytherin in possession, no. Gryffindor back in possession. And it's Katie Bell for Gryffindor with the quaffle. She's streaking up the field that was deliberate. Montague was back and had swerved in front of Katie, and instead of seizing the quaffle had grabbed her head. Katie cartwheeled in the air, managed to stay on her broom, but dropped the quaffle. Madam Hooch's whistle rang out again as she soared over to the Montague and began shouting at him. A minute later, Bell had put another penalty past the Slytherin keeper. 30-0. Take that, you dirty, cheating Jordan, if you can't commentate in an unbiased way. I'm telling it like it is, Professor. Look, Trasset yelled, throwing out her arm to point down the field. Violet followed her finger in time to see Harry speeding toward them, a wide grin on his face, Malfoy herring after him. Whoosh! Violet screamed as a bludger went streaking past Harry's right ear, hit by one of the gigantic Slytherin beaters. Then again, whoosh! The second bludger grazed Harry's elbow, and Violet flashed back to the year before, the vision of Harry's flopping, boneless arms swimming in her mind. Both beaters were now closing in, zooming toward him. Clubs raised. Harry turned his broom upward at the last second, and the beaters collided with a sickening crunch. Idiots, Cassius grumbled, but he was smirking. Ha-ha, yelled Lee Jordan, as the Slytherin beaters lurched away from each other, clutching their heads. Too bad, boys. You'll need to get up earlier than that to beat a firebolt. And it's Gryffindor in possession again, as Johnson takes the quaffle. Flint, alongside her, poke him in the eye, Angelina. It was a joke, Professor. It was a joke. Oh no, Flint in possession. Flint flying toward the Gryffindor goal posts. Come on now, Wood, save. But Flint had scored. There was an eruption of cheers from the Slytherin crowd, and Lee swore so badly that Professor McGonagall tried to tug the magical megaphone away from him. Sorry, Professor, sorry. Won't happen again. So Gryffindor in the lead, 30 points to 10, Gryffindor in possession. It was turning into the dirtiest game Violet had ever seen. Enraged that Gryffindor had taken such an early lead, Flint's team were rapidly resorting to any means to take the quaffle. Bowl hit Johnson with his club and tried to say he thought she was a bludger. George Weasley elbowed Bowl in the face in retaliation. Madam Hooch awarded both teams penalties, and Oliver Wood pulled off another spectacular save. The score was 40-10 to Gryffindor, and Violet was beginning to appreciate how much respect Harry afforded his team captain. Speaking of Harry, it was hard to keep track of him amidst all the chaos. Harry was very small and fast, and spent much of the game patrolling above the other players to keep an eye out for the golden snitch. Violet had no idea how he could possibly glimpse with everything going on, but that was what Harry was good at. He'd only failed to catch the snitch one time, and there had been 100 Dementors on the field to distract him then. Bell scored, 50-10. Fred and George Weasley were swooping around her, clubs raised, in case any of the Slytherins were thinking of revenge. Both Slytherin beaters, Derek and Bowl, took advantage of the Weasley twins' absence to aim both bludgers at Oliver Wood. They caught him in the stomach, one after the other, and he rolled over in the air, clutching his broom, completely winded. Madam Hooch was beside herself. You do not attack the keeper unless the quaffle is within the scoring area, she shrieked at Bowl and Derek. Gryffindor penalty, and Johnson scored, 60-10. Moments later, Fred Weasley pelted a bludger at Montague, knocking the quaffle out of his hands. Spinnet seized it and put it through the Slytherin goal, 70-10. The Gryffindor crowd at the opposite end of the pitch was screaming itself hoarse. Gryffindor was 60 points in the lead, and if Harry caught the snitch now, the cup was theirs. Violet crossed her fingers and searched the skies for Harry, wishing him all the luck in the world. She spotted him circling high above the crowds, with Malfoy speeding along behind him. And then Harry's broom put on a huge burst of speed. He must have spotted the snitch. His hand was stretched out, reaching for something too small for Violet to see. Oh, that little. Malfoy had sped up at the time as Harry and thrown himself forward, hand out, reaching not the snitch but for the twigs at the back of Harry's broomstick. Harry whipped around and saw him, and just like that the snitch vanished again. Penalty! Penalty to Gryffindor! I've never need such tactics, Madam Hooch screeched, shooting up to where Malfoy was sliding back onto his Nimbus 2001. You cheating scum! Lee Jordan was howling into the megaphone, dancing out of Professor McGonagall's reach. You filthy, cheating bee! Professor McGonagall didn't even bother to tell him off. She was actually shaking her finger in Malfoy's direction. Her hat had fallen off, and she too was shouting furiously. Spinnet took Gryffindor's penalty, but she was so angry she missed by several feet. The Gryffindor team was losing concentration, and the Slytherins, delighted by Malfoy's foul on Harry, were being spurred on to greater heights. Slytherin in possession, Slytherin heading for the goal. Montague scores, Lee groaned. 70-20 to Gryffindor. Violet kept her eyes on Malfoy and a hand on her wand in the pocket of her robes, silently daring him to try that sort of nonsense again. Luckily, Harry seemed to be watching him just as closely. He was now marking Malfoy so closely their knees kept hitting each other. Violet whooped as Malfoy tried to turn only for Harry to dart in front and block him. Angelina Johnson gets the quaffle for Gryffindor. Come on, Angelina, come on. Every single Slytherin player apart from Malfoy was streaking up the pitch toward Angelina, including the keeper. They were all going to block her, but then there was a dark shape shooting toward them like a bullet, scattering the lot with a wild scream. Harry had cleared the way. She scores, she scores. Gryffindor leads by 80 points to 20. Harry, who had almost pelted headlong into the stands, skidded to a halt in midair, reversed, and zoomed back into the middle of the field. Below! Cass was yelling, both hands cupped around his mouth. Look down, Potter. He was yelling to Harry, but Violet looked down as well and saw what Cassius was shouting about. Malfoy was diving. A look of triumph on his face there, a few feet above the grass, was a tiny golden glimmer. Harry shot downward so fast for a moment Violet thought his broom must have died beneath him. But he was gaining on Malfoy. Harry was flat against the handle of his broom. Dodging a bludger that was pelted at him, he was at Malfoy's ankles. He was level. Get it, Harry! Violet screamed, jumping to her feet. Harry, go! Harry, too far to have heard her, threw himself forward, took both hands off his broom. He knocked Malfoy's arm out of the way, and Harry pulled out his dive, his hand in the air, and the stadium exploded. Harry soared above the crowd, waving his arm, and Violet jumped wildly in place, clapping and screaming, and hanging on to her friends, even as the rest of their housemates booed and groaned around them. He won! Violet was screaming, grabbing hard onto Tracy and Cass's hands and throwing them into the air along with her own. He won, he won. Harry won. There was no hope of getting down onto the field. Wave upon wave of Crimson supporters were pouring over the barriers onto the pitch, but the Slytherin crowd remained stubbornly in place, throwing down their flags and swearing, throwing dirty looks toward an oblivious Violet. This wasn't her victory, but it was her brother who had won. He'd real Iwan, and she was so proud of him.